There's a moment when you realize that boredom can be more dangerous than any addiction. It creeps up slowly, day after day, of the same routine, until suddenly you're willing to do almost anything just to feel something different. That's how I ended up in a situation that still keeps me awake at night, checking the locks on my door and wondering if those footsteps in the hallway outside are just my imagination. I was in my second year at Leeds, studying media communications. One of those degrees that sounds impressive but basically prepares you for nothing except disappointment. Living in a grotty flat in Headingley that I could barely afford on my student loan. Spending most evenings alone because my flatmates had either dropped out or transferred to proper universities where they actually learned useful skills. The flat was everything you'd expect from student accommodation that charged £300 a month. Damp patches on the ceiling, heating that worked when it felt like it, and walls so thin you could hear the neighbours arguing about whose turn it was to buy toilet roll. My room was just large enough for a single bed, a desk that wobbled if you looked at it wrong, and a wardrobe that smelled permanently of mildew. Most nights followed the same pattern. Lectures during the day where lecturers who'd never worked in media told us about industries they'd only read about in textbooks. Then back to the flat for microwave meals and whatever passed for entertainment on my ancient laptop. I'd scroll through social media, watch YouTube videos, occasionally attempt to do coursework that felt increasingly pointless with each passing week. That's how I discovered the forums. Not deliberately. I was researching something for an essay about digital communities when I stumbled across discussions that went deeper than anything I'd seen on mainstream platforms. People talking about privacy, digital freedom, the parts of the internet that existed beyond corporate oversight. It seemed more real than anything I was learning in lectures, more honest than the sanitized world of Facebook and Instagram. The transition to exploring these hidden communities happened gradually. Someone would mention a forum that required special access, or reference a discussion happening on platforms I'd never heard of. Gradually, I learned about tools that could hide your digital footprint, networks that existed parallel to the regular internet but invisible to casual users. It wasn't difficult to access once you knew where to look. There were guides, communities dedicated to helping newcomers navigate safely. Within a few weeks, I had access to a whole parallel internet that felt more authentic than anything I'd encountered in my media studies courses. Most of it was surprisingly mundane. Political discussions that would be censored elsewhere, marketplaces for things that existed in legal grey areas, communities of people who simply preferred to communicate without corporate surveillance. It felt like discovering a hidden city that existed alongside the one everyone else knew about. The first few months, I just observed, reading forums about digital rights, privacy advocacy, discussions of philosophy and politics that went deeper than anything happening in university seminars. There was something addictive about being part of these communities, people who seemed more intelligent, more informed, more aware of how the world actually worked than anyone I knew in real life. I started contributing to discussions, sharing thoughts about media manipulation and corporate control of information. My posts were well received, and gradually I began to build a reputation within certain communities. People started recognizing my username, inviting me to private forums with more exclusive content. That's where I first heard about live streaming communities. Not the obvious stuff, gaming streams and social media influencers, but underground networks that broadcast content you couldn't find anywhere else. Documentary footage from conflict zones, investigative reports that mainstream media wouldn't touch, real journalism that existed outside corporate control. The concept appealed to me immediately. As someone studying media, The idea of accessing unfiltered content, seeing events as they actually happened rather than how they were packaged for mass consumption, felt like the logical extension of everything I was learning about information control and narrative manipulation. The invitation came through a private message from someone I'd been discussing media theory with for several weeks. They'd noticed my interest in authentic journalism and wondered if I'd like to observe some live investigative work. A research collective, they called it, documenting social experiments and human behavior studies that universities wouldn't approve, but which provided genuine insights into psychology and social dynamics. They included access details for a private streaming platform and a scheduled time, that Thursday at 10:30. No explanation of what specific research I'd be observing, just an invitation to witness something most people would never see. The academic framing made it feel legitimate, important, like I was being offered access to cutting-edge research that would enhance my understanding of media and human behavior. The streaming platform was simple but professional looking. Clean interface, high-quality video feeds, chat functionality that allowed viewers to discuss what they were observing. When I connected at the appointed time, there were already about 15 people online, and they welcomed me warmly. The conversation was exactly what I'd expected from an academic community. People discussed research methodologies, shared insights about psychological principles, debated the ethics of observational studies. Someone mentioned they were pursuing a PhD in social psychology at Durham. Another person talked about their work in documentary filmmaking. They seemed like exactly the kind of intelligent, engaged people I'd been hoping to find in university, but never had. The research subject that night was social isolation and peer pressure. We were observing how an individual responded to being placed in an unfamiliar environment with limited social contact, measuring their psychological adaptation and decision-making under stress. The academic discussion was fascinating. People analyzed body language, predicted behavioral responses, shared relevant research from established psychology journals. The observation space was a small, clinical-looking room with white walls and professional lighting. A single chair faced multiple cameras, and monitoring equipment lined one wall. It looked exactly like the kind of setup you'd expect from a legitimate research facility, clean and organized, and obviously expensive. The subject was a young man, probably around my age, who'd volunteered for what he believed was a standard psychology experiment. The researchers explained through the chat that he'd been told he was participating in a study about decision-making under stress, which was technically accurate, but didn't reveal the full scope of what was being measured. What followed was subtle psychological manipulation presented as scientific methodology. The subject was asked to make increasingly difficult choices, each decision designed to measure his responses to social pressure and isolation. The academic observers discussed his reactions with clinical detachment, noting signs of stress and predicting how his behavior would change as the experiment progressed. I found myself genuinely engaged with the research. This was the kind of real-world psychology that my university courses only touched on theoretically. Here was an actual experiment, measuring genuine human responses in controlled conditions. The academic discussion was more sophisticated than anything happening in my lectures, and I felt privileged to be observing cutting-edge research as it happened. Over the following weeks, I became a regular participant in these observation sessions. Different subjects, different experimental scenarios, but always the same rigorous academic approach. The research collective was studying various aspects of human psychology: social conformity, authority compliance, stress responses, decision-making under pressure. Each session provided new insights that enhanced my understanding of media manipulation and audience psychology. The other observers were consistently impressive. Postgraduate students, academic researchers, documentary filmmakers interested in authentic human behavior. They shared reading recommendations, discussed theoretical frameworks, debated ethical considerations with the kind of intellectual sophistication I'd been hoping to find in university. These felt like the real education I'd been looking for. My contributions to the discussions were increasingly valued by the group. They seemed impressed by my insights into media theory and audience psychology, often asking for my perspective on how different experimental scenarios might be perceived by mainstream audiences. Gradually, I began to feel like a genuine member of the research community rather than just an observer. That's when they started suggesting I might be interested in contributing more directly to the research. The suggestion came casually, almost as an afterthought, during a particularly engaging discussion about experimental methodology. Someone mentioned that having perspectives from different academic backgrounds would enhance the research, and several people agreed that my media studies knowledge would provide valuable insights into audience psychology and narrative construction. The research coordinator, the person who'd originally invited me, explained that they were always looking for participants who understood the academic value of the work. Someone with my background could contribute both as an observer and as a subject, providing comparative data about how media-literate individuals responded to the same experimental conditions they'd been testing on less educated volunteers. I felt flattered. These people, whose intelligence and academic credentials I respected, were telling me I had something valuable to offer. They weren't just inviting me to observe research. They were asking me to become part of it, to contribute to studies that could advance understanding of human psychology and media manipulation. The logistics were straightforward. They operated several research facilities around the country, including one in Manchester that would be convenient for me to reach from Leeds. Sessions typically lasted a few hours, and participants were compensated for their time. More importantly, I would be contributing to research that had genuine academic value, work that might eventually be published in respected journals. I agreed without hesitation. The opportunity to be part of legitimate psychological research, especially research that aligned with my academic interests, was exactly the kind of experience that would distinguish my degree from the theoretical nonsense most of my classmates were learning. The arrangements were handled through encrypted messaging, which seemed appropriate for sensitive research that hadn't yet been published. They provided an address in Manchester's city centre and a time, the following Saturday at 2 p.m. I was told to bring identification and any questions I might have about the research methodology. The building was exactly what I'd expected from a legitimate research facility. Modern office block in Manchester's business district, professional signage, security desk in the lobby. I gave my name to the receptionist, who confirmed my appointment and directed me to the 7th floor. The research coordinator met me at the lift, an academic-looking woman in her 40s who introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Mitchell. She seemed exactly right for the role, speaking with the kind of measured authority I associated with university lecturers, but with more genuine warmth than most of my actual professors managed. The facility itself was impressive. Clean corridors lined with office doors bearing academic titles, research laboratories with expensive-looking equipment, meeting rooms where serious-looking people discussed what appeared to be legitimate academic work. Everything reinforced the impression that this was real research being conducted by qualified professionals. Dr. Mitchell explained the day's experimental protocol as we walked towards the observation room. They were testing responses to social isolation, combined with peer pressure, measuring how quickly intelligent individuals adapted their behavior when placed in unfamiliar social situations. My media studies background made me an ideal subject, she explained, because I would be more aware than most people of the techniques being used, allowing them to measure the effectiveness of these methods on educated, media-literate participants. The observation room was larger than it had appeared through the streaming platform. The same clinical white walls and professional lighting, but seeing it in person made the setup seem even more legitimate. This was clearly expensive equipment, operated by people who knew what they were doing. Other members of the research team were present, people I recognized from the streaming sessions, though seeing them in person made them seem more human, more relatable. They greeted me warmly, expressing genuine excitement about my participation in the research. Someone mentioned that my insights during previous observation sessions had been particularly valuable, and they were looking forward to seeing how I responded as a subject rather than an observer. The initial part of the experiment was exactly what I'd expected. Basic questionnaires about my background and psychological profile, measurements of baseline stress indicators, explanations of the monitoring equipment that would track my responses throughout the session. Everything was conducted with the kind of professional methodology I associated with legitimate academic research. Then they explained the specific experimental scenario. I would be placed in the observation chair and asked to make a series of decisions while being monitored by the research team. The decisions would start simple but gradually become more complex, measuring how my responses changed as social pressure increased. The other team members would observe through a live stream, documenting my reactions and discussing my behavior in real time. The academic framing made everything seem reasonable, even beneficial. This was research that could advance understanding of media manipulation and audience psychology. My participation would contribute to studies that might eventually help people recognize and resist propaganda techniques. The work had genuine social value, and I was privileged to be part of it. I took my place in the observation chair, facing the cameras that would broadcast my responses to the research team. The lighting was professional but not uncomfortable, and the monitoring equipment was less intrusive than I'd expected. Dr. Mitchell explained that the session would last approximately 2 hours, during which I would be asked to respond to various scenarios while my psychological and physiological responses were measured. The first scenarios were straightforward, simple decision-making exercises designed to establish baseline measurements. I was asked to choose between different options while the research team observed my thought processes. The discussions I could hear through speakers in the room were exactly what I'd participated in during previous sessions. Academic analysis of body language, stress indicators, decision-making patterns. But gradually, the scenarios became more personal. Instead of abstract choices, I was asked to discuss my own life, my fears, my ambitions. The research team's observations became more focused on my individual psychology rather than general human behavior. Their academic discussions started including specific details about my background that I hadn't provided during the initial questionnaires. That's when I began to realize something was wrong. The information they were discussing, details about my university course, my financial situation, my family background, hadn't come from anything I told them during the session. They knew about my student debt, my poor relationship with my parents, my lack of close friendships at university, information that could only have come from extensive research into my personal life. Dr. Mitchell noticed my growing discomfort and explained that background research was standard procedure for this type of psychological study. They needed to understand participants' motivational frameworks to properly analyze their responses. The information had been gathered through standard academic channels, student records, social media analysis, public databases. Nothing invasive, just the kind of background research that any legitimate study would require. But the academic observers' discussions were becoming less clinical and more personal. They talked about my loneliness, my desperation for intellectual connection, my willingness to do almost anything to feel part of a community that valued my contributions. Their analysis was accurate but felt invasive, like they were dissecting my personality for entertainment rather than scientific understanding. The scenarios they presented became increasingly uncomfortable. Instead of simple decision-making exercises, I was asked to discuss my deepest insecurities, my most embarrassing experiences, my greatest fears. The research team's observations became correspondingly more intimate, analyzing not just my responses, but my motivations, my psychological vulnerabilities, my desperate need for validation. When I expressed discomfort with the direction the session was taking, Dr. Mitchell assured me that this was normal. Psychological research often required participants to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. The temporary discomfort I was experiencing was necessary for the research to have genuine value. Backing out now would invalidate hours of preparation and waste the opportunity to contribute to important academic work. The pressure was subtle but persistent. They reminded me of how enthusiastic I'd been about participating, how much I'd valued being part of the research community, how disappointed they would be if I couldn't follow through on my commitment. The academic framing made my reluctance seem immature, unintellectual, as if I was prioritizing my personal comfort over scientific advancement. But the observers' discussions were becoming less about research and more about entertainment. They talked about my responses as if I was performing for their amusement, rather than contributing to academic study. Their analysis of my psychology became increasingly invasive, dissecting my personality with the kind of casual cruelty that had nothing to do with scientific methodology. That's when I realized that the academic observers weren't researchers or graduate students. They were paying customers, anonymous viewers who enjoyed watching real psychological manipulation presented as legitimate research. The sophisticated discussions, the academic credentials, the professional facility, all of it was elaborate theater designed to make victims complicit in their own exploitation. I tried to leave, but Dr. Mitchell explained that the session wasn't complete. They'd invested significant resources in this research, and my participation was crucial for the data to have statistical validity. Leaving now would waste months of preparation and invalidate everything they'd learned. More importantly, I'd signed consent forms agreeing to participate in the full experimental protocol. The consent forms I'd signed so casually were more comprehensive than I'd realized. I'd agreed not just to participate in psychological research, but to continue until the academic objectives were met. I'd waived rights to withdraw consent during the session, acknowledging that temporary discomfort was necessary for legitimate research. I'd even agreed to confidentiality clauses that would prevent me from discussing the specific methodologies being used. The observers' discussions became openly predatory. They talked about how long I would resist, what it would take to break down my remaining psychological defenses, how much payment they were willing to make for specific responses. The academic pretense was dropped entirely, replaced by the casual cruelty of people who enjoyed watching others suffer. But I was still in the chair, facing cameras that broadcast my growing panic to anonymous viewers who were betting on my psychological breakdown. The professional lighting that had seemed so legitimate now felt harsh, clinical, designed to capture every detail of my distress for the entertainment of people I would never see. Dr. Mitchell continued to frame everything in academic terms, but her explanations became increasingly hollow. This was research into psychological resilience, she insisted. My responses were providing valuable data about stress management and social compliance. The temporary discomfort I was experiencing was necessary for the advancement of human understanding. The session continued for hours. Psychological pressure disguised as research methodology, invasive questioning presented as scientific inquiry, deliberate humiliation framed as academic observation. The anonymous viewers discussed my responses with the detached interest of people watching a particularly engaging television program, placing bets on how long I would maintain my composure. I don't remember exactly how I got away. The details are blurred by stress and the psychological manipulation I'd endured. I think there was some kind of technical problem with the streaming equipment, a brief moment when the observers were distracted, and I managed to leave the chair and find the exit. Or maybe Dr. Mitchell simply decided the session had provided enough entertainment for the paying viewers. I found myself on a Manchester street with no clear memory of how I'd gotten there. The business district looked normal, professional, exactly like somewhere legitimate research might be conducted. But I knew now that the building I'd just left was something else entirely. A facility designed to exploit people's desire for intellectual connection and academic validation. The journey back to Leeds was a blur. I sat on the train staring out the window, trying to process what had happened. The academic discussions I'd found so engaging, the research community I'd felt so privileged to join, the intellectual validation I'd craved so desperately. All of it had been designed to make me complicit in my own exploitation. That was 8 months ago. I've never reported what happened. Who would believe that a legitimate-seeming research facility was actually a sophisticated operation designed to exploit curious students? The academic credentials seemed real. The facility was professional, and I'd participated voluntarily after signing consent forms that probably covered every legal requirement. But I've learned to recognize the signs now. The casual invitations to observe research, the flattery about academic insight, the gradual escalation from observer to participant. The same patterns that led me into that room are being used to recruit other people, other students, who are bored and lonely and desperate for intellectual connection. I still get invitations occasionally, from different usernames on different platforms. Always the same academic framing, the same promise of authentic research opportunities. I delete them immediately, but I can't delete the knowledge that somewhere out there people are still being recruited for research projects that have nothing to do with advancing human understanding. The flat in Headingley feels different now. The thin walls and broken heating that once seemed like minor inconveniences now feel like vulnerabilities. I've changed my daily routines, varied my schedule, become more careful about what personal information I share online. But sometimes, late at night, when the building is quiet and I'm lying awake listening to footsteps in the corridor, I wonder if they know where I live. Because the thing about that kind of operation is that they don't just exploit you once and move on. They build profiles, gather information, create detailed psychological assessments that could be valuable for future projects. I was part of their research for months before I became a subject, and they learned everything they needed to know about what motivates me, what frightens me, what I'm willing to do for validation and intellectual connection. The academic community I thought I'd found doesn't exist. Real research happens in universities with proper oversight and ethical guidelines. But the desire for intellectual connection, for being part of something important and meaningful, is real enough. And there are people who understand how to exploit that desire, how to make isolation and boredom feel like academic opportunity. I'm finishing my degree this year, though media communications feels even more pointless now than it did before. The theoretical frameworks we study in lectures seem naive compared to what I've learned about psychological manipulation and social engineering. But I've also learned that the real world is full of people who understand human psychology better than any university course could teach. The chair is still out there somewhere, in a professional-looking facility with academic credentials and research equipment. And they're still recruiting participants, still finding people who are bored enough and lonely enough and desperate enough for intellectual validation to sign consent forms they don't fully understand. Sometimes I think about the young man I observed during my first session, the volunteer who thought he was participating in standard psychological research. I wonder if he ever realized what was really happening, if he managed to leave before they asked him to become a regular participant, if he's somewhere now checking logs and listening for footsteps and wondering if those casual invitations he receives are what they claim to be. Because once you've been in that chair, once you felt those cameras capturing every detail of your psychological breakdown for the entertainment of anonymous viewers, you never really feel safe again. The academic pretense might be dropped, the session might end, but the knowledge that there are people out there who enjoy watching human suffering remains. I remember it perfectly, the way my hands shook when I first saw the invitation. Not from fear, mind you, but from pure excitement. Finally, after months of searching through dead links and forum posts that led nowhere, I'd found something real, something that might actually prove that the stories were true. At 17, I was obsessed with urban legends, not the obvious ones that everyone knew. Bloody Mary, the vanishing hitchhiker, that sort of nonsense. I was interested in the modern myths, the digital folklore that had grown up around the internet's darker corners. Stories about hidden websites where you could watch live murders, chat rooms where people planned real crimes, streaming services that broadcast things no civilized society should ever see. My mates thought I was mental, spending my evenings trawling through obscure forums and following breadcrumb trails that usually led to nothing but rickrolls and dead ends. But I knew there had to be something out there. The internet was too vast, too unregulated for these stories to be completely made up. Somewhere in the depths of the dark web, real horrors were happening, and I was determined to find them. The breakthrough came during the summer holidays before my final year at sixth form. My parents had gone to Spain for a fortnight, leaving me alone in our house in Kettering with strict instructions to revise for my A-levels and not throw any parties. Instead, I spent every waking hour diving deeper into corners of the internet I'd never explored before. I'd been using privacy tools for months by then, learned about them from a forum dedicated to internet mysteries. The dark web wasn't as scary as people made it out to be. Mostly just forums and marketplaces that looked like they'd been designed in the 90s. But there were layers beneath the obvious stuff. Communities that required invitations and references to access. The invitation arrived through a private message on an obscure forum about digital anthropology. The sender's username was just a string of random characters, and their profile showed they'd only joined the day before. The message was short, almost casual. They'd noticed my posts about online myths and wondered if I'd be interested in observing something authentic. A research project, they called it, studying human behavior in controlled environments. They included a link to a private chat room and a time. That night at 11:30. No explanation of what I'd be observing or why they'd chosen me specifically. Just an invitation to witness something most people would never see. I should have been suspicious. I should have realized that legitimate researchers don't recruit random teenagers from internet forums. But at 17, the possibility of finally seeing something real, something that would prove all those urban legends had a basis in fact, was too tempting to ignore. The chat room was simple, just a basic interface with a list of active users and a message window. When I connected at the appointed time, there were already 8 people online. They welcomed me warmly, asking where I was from and how I'd heard about the research project. Everyone seemed friendly, genuinely interested in my background and what had brought me to the dark web in the first place. The conversation was surprisingly normal. People discussed university courses, summer jobs, films they'd watched recently. Someone mentioned they were studying psychology at Manchester. Another person talked about their gap year travels. They could have been any group of young people chatting online, except for the undercurrent of anticipation that ran through every exchange. Around midnight, a new user joined, the same random character string who'd invited me. They thanked everyone for participating and explained that tonight's session would be particularly interesting. They'd arranged for us to observe a live demonstration of psychological pressure techniques, something that would help us understand how people responded to stress in controlled situations. A new window opened in my browser, showing what appeared to be a small, windowless room with concrete walls. A single chair sat in the center, facing multiple cameras. The lighting was harsh, clinical, like something from a hospital or laboratory. It looked exactly like the red rooms described in all those urban legends, except there was nothing obviously sinister about it, just an empty room with professional-looking equipment. The chat exploded with excitement. Everyone seemed genuinely thrilled to be witnessing what they called a breakthrough in behavioral research. They discussed the camera angles, the lighting setup, the professional quality of the production. It felt academic, scientific, like we were part of something important rather than something wrong. Then someone entered the room. It was a young man, probably not much older than me, wearing casual clothes and looking confused about where he was. He examined the chair, the cameras, the concrete walls with growing bewilderment. The researcher who'd invited us explained through the chat that this was a volunteer who'd agreed to participate in the study, though the specific nature of the experiment had been kept confidential to ensure authentic responses. The other viewers began making observations about the subject's behavior, noting his body language and facial expressions with the detached interest of psychology students. They discussed his apparent anxiety levels, speculated about his background, made predictions about how he would respond to different stimuli. I found myself caught up in their enthusiasm. This was exactly what I'd been searching for. Proof that the internet's hidden corners contained genuine research, real experiments that pushed the boundaries of what was considered ethical. The academic tone of the discussion made everything feel legitimate, important, like we were witnessing something that would advance human understanding. The volunteer was asked to sit in the chair. Through the chat, the researcher explained that they would be testing various psychological pressure techniques, measuring how quickly social isolation and peer pressure could influence decision-making. The cameras would record everything for later analysis by university research teams. What followed was subtle at first. The volunteer was asked simple questions through speakers we couldn't see, his answers recorded by the cameras from multiple angles. The chat observers discussed his responses, noting signs of stress or discomfort, predicting how long it would take for the isolation to affect his mental state. But gradually, the atmosphere in the chat began to shift. The academic discussion became more personal, more focused on the individual rather than the research. People started making comments about the volunteer's appearance, his nervousness, the way he kept looking at the cameras as if seeking help that wasn't coming. Someone suggested that the experiment would be more effective with multiple subjects. The researcher agreed, explaining that they'd been hoping to expand the study, but had struggled to find suitable volunteers. The work was too important to abandon, they said, and the insights they were gaining were invaluable. That's when they asked if any of us would be interested in participating directly. The request was casual, almost offhand. They'd learned so much from observing our reactions in the chat, the researcher explained, that having one of us experience the experiment firsthand would provide crucial comparative data. It would only take a few hours, and participants would be contributing to groundbreaking research into human psychology. The other chat users immediately began encouraging me to volunteer. They said I'd shown the most insight during the observation, that my comments had demonstrated a real understanding of the psychological principles at work. The researcher agreed, noting that my posts on the forum had shown exceptional maturity for someone my age. I felt flattered, chosen. These people, who seemed so knowledgeable and sophisticated, were telling me I had something special to offer. The volunteer in the room was clearly finding the experience difficult, but that was the point. Real research required genuine responses, and I would be helping advance scientific understanding in ways most people never could. The arrangements were surprisingly simple. They would send a car to collect me the following evening. The session would take place at a research facility in Birmingham, not far from where I lived. I would be driven home afterwards, and my participation would remain completely confidential. They even mentioned a small payment for my time, though they stressed that the real reward would be the knowledge that I'd contributed to important academic work. I agreed without really thinking it through. The combination of flattery, peer pressure, and genuine curiosity overrode any sensible concerns I might have had. These people seemed legitimate, professional, interested in real research rather than anything sinister. And after months of searching for authentic mysteries, the chance to be part of something genuine was impossible to resist. The car arrived exactly when they'd said it would. A black saloon with tinted windows, driven by a middle-aged man who seemed pleasant enough. He didn't talk much during the journey, just confirmed my name and explained that we'd be arriving at the facility within the hour. But as we drove through Birmingham's outskirts, I began to notice things that didn't feel right. The route we were taking didn't lead to any university campus or research facility I was familiar with. Instead, we seemed to be heading towards an industrial area full of warehouses and abandoned factories. When I asked about our destination, the driver just smiled and said we'd be there soon. The research facility was deliberately located away from populated areas, he explained, to ensure complete privacy for sensitive experiments. Academic ethics required absolute confidentiality, especially when dealing with cutting-edge psychological research. We pulled up outside a nondescript warehouse with no signs or identifying features. Just a building that could have contained anything, surrounded by empty car parks and darkened windows. The driver led me to a side entrance and used a key card to let us in. Inside, the warehouse had been converted into something that looked more like a television studio than a research facility. Professional lighting equipment, multiple cameras, and in the center of the space, a small concrete room with a single chair facing the cameras. The same room I'd been watching through my computer screen the night before. That's when I realized that the friendly chat room observers, the academic researcher, the volunteer I'd watched with such detached interest, none of it had been real. Or rather, it had been real, but not in the way I'd understood. I hadn't been observing a research project. I'd been watching an audition. The other people were already there, waiting. The same usernames from the chat room, but now revealed as ordinary-looking adults with cameras and recording equipment. They greeted me with the same friendly enthusiasm they'd shown online, explaining that everything was set up for tonight's session. I was the volunteer now, the one who would sit in the chair while others watched and discussed my responses with academic detachment. Except there was nothing academic about it, and the people observing weren't psychology students or researchers. They were just people who enjoyed watching others in distress. The transition happened so gradually that I didn't immediately recognize it as coercion. They asked if I wanted to see the setup, if I was curious about how the equipment worked, whether I'd like to experience the same experiment I'd found so fascinating the night before. Their tone remained friendly, encouraging, as if this was all part of the natural progression from observer to participant. But when I said I'd changed my mind, that I wanted to go home, their demeanor shifted. Not dramatically. They didn't become threatening or aggressive. Instead, they became disappointed, as if I was letting down the team after they'd invested so much time and effort in bringing me there. They reminded me of how enthusiastic I'd been the night before, how much insight I'd shown into the psychological principles at work. They'd specifically chosen me, they said, because I'd demonstrated such maturity and understanding. Backing out now would ruin months of preparation and waste the opportunity to contribute to something genuinely important. The peer pressure was subtle but relentless. They made me feel selfish for wanting to leave, ungrateful for the opportunity I'd been given, immature for not following through on my commitment. And always, underlying everything, was the implication that I didn't really have a choice anymore. I'd come there voluntarily, they pointed out. I'd agreed to participate in the research. I'd been driven to a location I couldn't identify, with people whose real names I didn't know, who would believe that I'd been coerced if I tried to report what was happening. The chair sat in the center of the room, surrounded by cameras and lights, waiting for me to take my place. They assured me it would only take a few hours, that thousands of people online were waiting to observe the session, that my participation would provide valuable insights into human psychology. But I knew now that the people watching wouldn't be interested in academic research. They would be paying customers, anonymous viewers, who enjoyed watching real fear and genuine distress. The urban legends I'd spent months trying to prove were real, and I was about to become part of one. That was 3 months ago. I never sat in the chair, managed to get away when the driver stepped outside for a cigarette break and left the warehouse door unlocked. I ran through unfamiliar streets until I found a main road and flagged down a taxi. Made it home before my parents returned from their holiday. I've never reported what happened. Who would believe that I'd stumbled into a real Red Room operation while searching for urban legends? The police would think I was making it up, or worse, that I'd been involved in something I shouldn't have been. But sometimes, late at night when I'm trying to sleep, I wonder about that chair, whether it's still there, in that converted warehouse in Birmingham's industrial district, whether other teenagers, drawn by the same curiosity that nearly destroyed me, are discovering friendly chat rooms and academic research projects that promise to show them something real. And I wonder whether any of them are smart enough to run when they realize what they've actually found. The invitation messages still arrive occasionally, from different usernames on different forums. Always the same casual tone, the same promise of authentic observation opportunities. I delete them immediately now, but I can't delete the knowledge that somewhere out there the chair is waiting. Imagine you're lying awake at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling of your bedsit in Croydon, listening to the couple upstairs having another screaming match through the paper-thin walls. The divorce papers are still scattered across your kitchen table from where your solicitor dropped them off that afternoon, and the reality of your new life, if you can call it that, is starting to sink in properly. That's how it started for me anyway. 6 months of sleeping rough on my mate's sofa until I could scrape together enough for the deposit on this place. 38 years old and starting over with nothing but a suitcase and a laptop that'd seen better days. The insomnia had been getting worse since the split. Sarah had kept the house, obviously. Her name was on the mortgage. Her parents had helped with the deposit. Fair enough, I suppose. But it didn't make the transition any easier. I tried everything for the sleeplessness. Herbal teas, meditation apps, those expensive blackout curtains that promised to transform your bedroom into a cave. Nothing worked. By 3:30 most nights, I'd given up entirely and found myself hunched over the laptop at my tiny kitchen table, aimlessly scrolling through whatever rubbish the internet had to offer. It was during one of these late-night sessions that I first stumbled across the forums. Not the usual Reddit threads or Facebook groups, deeper than that. Someone on a cryptocurrency discussion board had mentioned something about hidden marketplaces, places where you could find things that weren't available through normal channels. Nothing sinister, mind you, just hard-to-find electronics, rare books, that sort of thing. The conversation had piqued my curiosity. I'd heard about the dark web before, of course. Everyone has. Usually in the context of drug dealers and identity theft. The sort of thing that makes for sensational newspaper headlines. But there was something almost academic about the way these forum users discussed it. They talked about privacy, about digital freedom, about accessing information that governments and corporations would prefer you didn't see. It seemed less criminal, more philosophical. I told myself I just wanted to see what all the fuss was about. The browser installed easily enough, though it took ages to connect through all those layers. When it finally loaded, I found myself staring at a search engine that looked like something from the early days of the internet. Basic, functional, utterly unremarkable. For the first few nights, I just browsed randomly. There were forums dedicated to every conceivable topic. Marketplaces selling everything from vintage records to questionable pharmaceutical products, and endless political discussions that made the comments section of any mainstream news site look positively civilized. Most of it was surprisingly mundane, actually. Not the digital den of iniquity I'd been expecting. The red rooms were mentioned in passing during a conversation about live streaming technology. Someone had posted a technical question about bandwidth requirements for real-time video, and another user had made a joke about not needing that much speed unless you were running a red room. Several people had laughed, or at least posted laughing emojis, but I didn't get the reference. A bit of searching revealed that red rooms were supposedly live streams where viewers could watch and direct real-time violence. Urban legend stuff, mostly. Digital folklore. Every explanation I found came with disclaimers about how they probably didn't really exist. How the stories were just myths designed to make the dark web seem more sinister than it actually was. The consensus seemed to be that the technical requirements alone made them impractical. Real-time video streaming over Tor was unreliable at best, and the whole premise seemed more like something from a horror film than actual criminal enterprise. Still, the idea lingered. During those long, sleepless nights, I found myself thinking about it more than I probably should have. Not because I wanted to find one, you understand. The whole concept was revolting. But there was something compulsive about the mystery of it, like picking at a scab or probing a sore tooth with your tongue. It was probably around my third week of regular dark web browsing when I first saw the link. Hidden in a forum discussion about online privacy, posted by a user with a string of random characters for a name. No description, no context, just an address that was significantly longer than the usual ones I'd encountered. Something about it looked different, more complex, more deliberately obscured. I stared at that link for the better part of an hour. Common sense told me to close the browser, make some tea, maybe try to get some sleep. But curiosity is a powerful thing, especially when you're sitting alone in a grotty bedsit at 4 a.m. with nothing but your own thoughts for company. The page took nearly 10 minutes to load. When it finally appeared, it was almost disappointingly simple. Just a black background with a single video player embedded in the center. No text, no navigation, nothing to indicate what I was looking at. The video player showed a loading symbol, slowly spinning against the darkness. Then it started. The feed was grainy, clearly shot with a cheap webcam in poor lighting. It showed what appeared to be a small, windowless room with concrete walls. There was a single chair in the center, currently empty, and a table pushed against one wall. The image quality was terrible, pixelated and stuttering, with frequent dropouts that left the screen frozen for several seconds at a time. For the first few minutes, nothing happened. Just an empty room, occasionally flickering as the video stream struggled to maintain connection. I was beginning to think it was just some sort of technical test when I noticed the chat window that had appeared beside the video player. The messages were scrolling past too quickly to read properly, but I caught fragments. Usernames that were just random strings of letters and numbers, posting short, cryptic comments. Some seemed to be discussing the technical quality of the stream. Others were asking when something was going to start. A few were considerably more explicit about what they hoped to see. I should have closed the browser then, should have deleted Tor, wiped my browsing history, and pretended I'd never seen any of it. Instead, I found myself refreshing the page, trying to get a clearer picture as the video quality fluctuated wildly. Around 4:30, someone entered the room. It was a man, though the poor image quality made it difficult to make out details. Middle-aged, wearing what looked like overalls or a boiler suit. He moved with purpose, arranging items on the table that I couldn't quite make out through the pixelated mess of the video feed. The chat window exploded with activity, dozens of messages appearing and disappearing faster than I could follow. The man in the overalls seemed to be responding to the chat, though I couldn't hear any audio. He would pause, look directly at the camera, then nod or shake his head. Sometimes he would hold up fingers, 1, 2, 3, as if counting or responding to numerical questions from the viewers. Then he left the room again, and we were back to the empty chair and concrete walls. The waiting was almost worse than whatever was coming next. The chat had settled into a steady rhythm of anticipation and crude speculation. I found myself checking the time obsessively. 4:30 became 4:45, then 5 o'clock, then 10 past. Part of me hoped nothing else would happen, that this was all some elaborate hoax or art project. But another part, a part I didn't particularly want to acknowledge, was curious about what came next. When the door opened again, he wasn't alone. The second figure was smaller, harder to make out in the poor lighting. They moved differently, hesitant, unsteady. As they got closer to the camera, I could see it was a woman, though the video quality made it impossible to determine much else about her appearance. She seemed confused, disoriented. The man in overalls guided her to the chair with what appeared to be gentle insistence. The chat went absolutely mental. Messages were appearing so fast, they were just a blur of text. I caught glimpses of betting odds, requests for specific actions, discussions of payment methods. Bitcoin addresses were being posted and immediately deleted. The whole thing had the atmosphere of a twisted auction, with viewers bidding on what they wanted to see happen next. I should have stopped watching, should have closed the laptop and walked away. But something kept me glued to the screen. Not excitement, not anticipation, but a kind of horrified fascination, like watching a car accident unfold in slow motion. The man in overalls had returned to his table and was selecting tools with the care of a surgeon. The woman in the chair seemed to be talking, though without audio, I could only see her mouth moving. She looked around the room with growing agitation, testing the restraints that I was only now noticing, held her to the chair. Then something changed in the chat. The frenzied betting and crude requests suddenly stopped, replaced by a series of identical messages from different users. Feed compromised, feed compromised, feed compromised. The video cut out entirely. For a moment, I stared at a blank screen showing only a connection error message. Then the browser crashed completely, taking me back to my desktop. When I tried to reload the Tor browser, it wouldn't connect at all, just sat there attempting to establish a connection through the encrypted network without success. I spent the next hour trying to get back online, convinced that my internet connection had failed or that there was some problem with my laptop. But regular websites loaded fine through Chrome. It was only Tor that refused to work, as if something had completely blocked my access to the dark web. By 6 a.m, I'd given up and tried to get some sleep. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that grainy video feed. The empty room, the concrete walls, the woman in the chair. I kept thinking about those final moments before the connection died. The way she'd looked around the room, the careful way the man had selected his tools, the frantic energy of the chat as viewers realized something was wrong. The next few days passed in a haze of exhaustion and paranoia. Tor still wouldn't connect, no matter what I tried. I reinstalled the browser, reset my internet connection, even ran a full virus scan in case I'd picked up some kind of malware. Nothing worked. It was as if my computer had been permanently banned from accessing the dark web entirely. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the email I received 3 days later. It arrived in my regular inbox, not buried in spam or sent through some anonymous service. Just a normal email from what appeared to be a Gmail account with a random string of numbers for an address. The subject line was blank, and the message contained only a single line of text. "We know you were watching." Below that was a screenshot, poor quality, pixelated, but unmistakably from that night. It showed my laptop screen with the red room video playing, but taken from behind and slightly to the side. Someone had been in my bedsit while I was watching, standing just out of my peripheral vision, close enough to photograph my screen over my shoulder. I checked the timestamp on the email. It had been sent at 4:47 a.m., right around the time the video feed had cut out. I called the police, of course, explained about the break-in, showed them the email. But what could they do? No signs of forced entry, nothing stolen, no physical evidence that anyone had been inside my flat. The email could have been sent from anywhere in the world. The screenshot could have been doctored. Without the original video, which I couldn't access anymore, there was no way to prove what I'd actually been watching. The officer who took my statement was polite, but clearly skeptical. He suggested I change my locks and maybe install a security camera, but his tone suggested he thought I was either lying or having some sort of breakdown. I couldn't really blame him. If someone had told me the same story 6 months earlier, I probably would have reacted the same way. That was 2 months ago. I've changed the locks twice, installed a chain and a door alarm, even moved my laptop so I can see the entire room while I'm using it. The insomnia has gotten worse, if anything. Most nights, I just sit at the kitchen table, watching the door and listening for footsteps in the hallway outside. Tor still won't work on my laptop. I've tried everything, different browsers, VPN services, even buying a completely new computer. Nothing connects. It's as if I've been permanently blacklisted from accessing that part of the internet entirely. But sometimes, late at night, when the building is quiet and I'm sitting alone with just the glow of the laptop screen, for company, I wonder if that's actually protection rather than punishment. Because if they could get into my flat once without leaving any trace, if they could take that photograph without me noticing, if they could block my internet access with such precision, what else might they be capable of? I never found out what happened to the woman in the chair, never learned whether what I witnessed was real or just an elaborate hoax designed to draw in curious viewers like myself. But I keep thinking about those final messages in the chat, feed compromised, and wondering if maybe, just maybe, someone had been trying to help her, or if they'd simply been warning each other about people like me. The thing that bothers me most isn't the email or the photograph or even the break-in. It's the timing. The feed cut out at exactly the moment when things were about to go too far, as if someone had been monitoring not just the stream but the viewers as well, as if they knew precisely when to pull the plug to leave people like me with just enough glimpse to be haunted, but not enough evidence to cause real trouble. I still get emails sometimes, never more than once a week, always from different addresses, usually just timestamps, 4:43 a.m., 4:51 a.m., 4:38 a.m., but occasionally something more specific. Last week, I received one that simply said, "Still watching." I don't know if they mean they're still watching me, or if they think I'm still watching them. Both possibilities keep me awake at night. Have you ever wondered what happens to the parts of yourself you lose in war? Not the obvious bits, the limbs, the hearing, the scars you can see in the mirror. I'm talking about the invisible pieces, the ability to sleep through the night without checking the locks 3 times, the capacity to sit in a restaurant without your back to the wall, the simple faith that most people are fundamentally decent. Those are the parts that don't grow back, no matter how many therapy sessions the doctors threw at you. I came back from Afghanistan in late 2018, medically discharged after an IED took out half my patrol and left me with a collection of metal fragments in my left leg and a head full of memories I couldn't switch off. The physical therapy was straightforward enough. Learn to walk properly again, build up the strength, adapt to the new limitations. The mental side was trickier. The flat they set me up with in Aldershot was decent enough. Ground floor, which suited the leg, and quiet neighbours who minded their own business. The occupational therapist had been very pleased with herself when she'd arranged it. Close to the base for support, she'd said, but far enough away to feel civilian. What she hadn't mentioned was how the silence would press against your ears at night, or how every settling beam and creaking pipe would send your heart racing. Sleep became something that happened to other people. I'd lie there listening to the world outside my window. The occasional car, a fox in the bins, the milk float doing its rounds at 4:30. Sometimes I'd doze off around dawn, only to wake up an hour later feeling worse than when I'd gone to bed. That's how I discovered the internet had a whole world that came alive when the rest of Britain was asleep. Forums for insomniacs, chat rooms for shift workers, communities of people who existed in the margins of normal daylight hours. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just human contact that didn't require explaining why I was awake at 3 in the morning or why crowds made me nervous. The transition from regular internet to the darker corners happened gradually. Someone in an insomnia forum mentioned privacy tools, ways to browse without leaving digital footprints. Given my background, the concept of operational security appealed to me. Old habits, I suppose. In the army, you learn to cover your tracks, to move without being seen, to gather intelligence without revealing your position. Installing Tor felt like putting on body armor, that same sense of protection, of creating barriers between yourself and potential threats. The dark web wasn't what I'd expected. Less criminal marketplace, more like a parallel internet where people could speak freely about things that wouldn't be tolerated on Facebook or Twitter. Political dissidents, whistleblowers, people living under authoritarian regimes. It felt purposeful, almost noble. The first few weeks I just observed. Reading forums about government surveillance, privacy rights, digital freedom. There was something therapeutic about it. Being part of a community that understood the value of staying hidden, of operating below the radar. These people got it in a way that civilian therapists never could. It was in one of these privacy forums that I first heard about red rooms, not from someone promoting them, but from a discussion about online myths and digital urban legends. Someone had posted a long thread debunking various dark web horror stories, explaining how most of the sensational stuff you read in newspapers was either exaggerated or completely fabricated. Red rooms, according to this poster, were particularly ridiculous. The technical challenges alone made them impractical. Streaming live video over Tor was unreliable, the latency was terrible, and the bandwidth requirements were enormous. More importantly, they argued, the risk to reward ratio made no sense. Why would criminals expose themselves to that level of surveillance and law enforcement attention when there were easier ways to make money? The post was thorough, well-researched, and completely convincing. It also had the unintended effect of making me curious about whether they actually existed. I told myself it was just intellectual curiosity. After years of intelligence work, you develop a natural skepticism about official narratives. When someone tells you something is impossible, your first instinct is to test that assertion. Not because you want to find something horrific, but because you want to understand how the world actually works, rather than how people say it works. The search took weeks. Most of the links I found led to obvious scams, sites demanding payment upfront or requiring personal information that any sensible person would never provide. Others were clearly honey traps, probably run by law enforcement agencies trying to catch people with questionable intentions. But occasionally, buried deep in technical discussions or hidden in the metadata of seemingly unrelated files, I'd find references that seemed more genuine. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. I'd been helping out at a veteran support group, not talking, just making tea and setting up chairs, when I overheard a conversation between two ex-Signals operators about online payment systems. They were discussing the profit margins on different digital services, and one of them mentioned that the real money wasn't in legitimate businesses, but in providing services that people couldn't get through normal channels. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. But something about the way he'd said it stuck with me. The next time I was browsing the dark web, I started looking at it differently. Instead of searching for red rooms directly, I started following the money, payment processors, digital transfer systems, the financial infrastructure that would be needed to support something like live streaming to paying customers. That's how I found the marketplace. It was hidden several layers deep, accessible only through a series of referral links that changed daily. The front page looked like any other dark web market. Drugs, fake documents, stolen credit card details. But there was a section marked Premium Services that required additional verification to access. The verification process was more thorough than anything I'd encountered. Not just prepayment through untraceable methods, but proof of identity that had to be cross-referenced against previous purchases, references from existing members, even a brief interview conducted through encrypted chat to confirm you weren't law enforcement. It took nearly a month to get approved, and by the time I did, I wasn't sure I actually wanted access anymore. But the same compulsion that had carried me through 3 tours in Afghanistan, the need to see a mission through to completion, kept me going. The Premium Services section was smaller than I'd expected. Maybe 30 or 40 listings, mostly for things that were disturbing, but not particularly surprising. Custom pornography, identity theft services, professional harassment campaigns, the sort of services that existed in the grey areas between legal and illegal, catering to people with money and flexible morals. The listings that interested me were at the bottom of the page in a subcategory marked Live Entertainment. 3 different providers, each offering real-time streaming services with interactive elements. The descriptions were deliberately vague. Authentic experiences, unscripted content, viewer participation opportunities. But the prices gave them away. These weren't webcam shows or adult entertainment. They were charging thousands of pounds for single sessions. I spent another week researching the providers before making contact with one. Their listing claimed to offer documentary-style content featuring real participants in authentic scenarios. The language was careful, designed to provide plausible deniability while making the actual service clear to interested buyers. The booking process was surprisingly professional. Encrypted email exchanges, detailed technical requirements for viewing, even a customer service representative who walked me through the setup process. They operated like a legitimate business, complete with scheduling systems and technical support. The session was arranged for a Tuesday night at 11:30. I was provided with a unique link and access credentials that would only work during a specific 2-hour window. The technical requirements were extensive: updated browsers, specific security plugins, a reliable internet connection with minimum bandwidth requirements. When the time came, I almost didn't connect. I sat at my laptop for nearly 20 minutes, cursor hovering over the link, trying to decide if I really wanted to see what I was about to see. In the end, it was the same morbid curiosity that had carried me this far. I needed to know if it was real. The stream loaded slowly, buffering every few seconds as the encrypted video fought its way through Tor's layered network. When it finally stabilized, I was looking at what appeared to be a basement or cellar. Concrete walls, a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, and a chair positioned in the center of the frame. For the first 10 minutes, nothing happened. Just an empty room with occasionally flickering lighting. As the video quality adjusted, I was beginning to think I'd been scammed when a figure appeared at the edge of the frame. It was a man in his 40s or 50s, wearing coveralls and latex gloves. He moved methodically around the room, checking equipment I couldn't quite see, adjusting the camera angle, preparing for something. His movements were practiced, professional. This wasn't his first time doing whatever he was about to do. A chat window had appeared beside the video player, showing messages from other viewers. There weren't many, maybe 8 or 10 people total, but they were clearly regulars. They talked about previous sessions, compared notes on different providers, discussed technical aspects of the streaming quality like they were reviewing a television program. Then someone else entered the room. She was young, probably early 20s, and clearly confused about where she was or how she'd gotten there. The man in coveralls guided her to the chair with gentle but firm insistence, speaking to her in what appeared to be a calming manner. She kept looking around the room, taking in the concrete walls and bare bulb and camera equipment with growing alarm. The chat exploded with activity. Viewers were making requests, placing bets, discussing what they wanted to see happen next. Payment details were being shared. Transactions were being arranged in real time. I watched in horrified fascination as what I was witnessing transformed from documentary into auction. I should have closed the browser, should have reported what I was seeing to the police, though I had no idea how to explain how I'd found it, or whether they'd even believe me. Instead, I found myself paralyzed by the same terrible fascination that had carried me through firefights in Helmand, that state of hyper-awareness where time slows down and you observe everything with crystalline clarity while being unable to act. The man in coveralls began responding to specific requests from the chat. He would pause, read something on a screen I couldn't see, then nod or shake his head. Sometimes he would hold up different tools for the camera, letting the viewers choose which one he should use. It was interactive in the most disturbing way possible. A live-streamed crime where the audience was complicit in every decision. Then something changed. The chat messages stopped, replaced by a single repeated warning from multiple users. Terminate session, terminate session, terminate session. The man in coveralls looked directly at the camera, his expression shifting from professional calm to genuine alarm. He moved quickly to something off screen, and seconds later the video cut out entirely. I stared at a blank screen, showing only a connection error message. When I tried to reload the page, the link was dead. The entire marketplace had vanished, as if it had never existed at all. Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself that what I'd witnessed had been staged. Elaborate theatre designed to part fools from their money. The production quality had been too professional, the interactive elements too seamless. Real criminals wouldn't operate with such sophisticated customer service and technical infrastructure. But I kept thinking about those final moments before the feed cut out. The way the man's expression had changed when he'd seen those warning messages. The speed with which everything had shut down. It felt less like a performance ending and more like an emergency evacuation. 3 weeks later, I received a package. It arrived by regular post, addressed to my flat with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, printed on ordinary paper with a home printer. It showed the interior of my living room, taken from the position of my laptop screen. I was visible in the background, sitting at my kitchen table, clearly recognizable despite the low light. On the back of the photograph, someone had written a single line in neat handwriting. "We know what you watched." I called the police immediately, reported the break-in, showed them the photograph, explained about the package. But what could they do? No signs of forced entry, nothing stolen, no way to trace where the photograph had come from. The officer who took my statement was polite, but clearly thought I was either paranoid or making it up. I've changed the logs 3 times since then, installed security cameras, motion sensors, even hired a private investigator to check if anyone had been asking questions about me. Nothing. Whoever had been in my flat had left no trace beyond that single photograph. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying awake, listening to the sounds of the building settling around me, I wonder if they ever really left. Because the thing about surveillance is that once you know you're being watched, you never stop feeling those eyes on you. I still get packages occasionally, never more than once a month, always delivered by regular post. Sometimes it's another photograph, my kitchen, my bedroom, the view from my living room window. Once, it was a printout of my medical records from the army. Last month, it was a copy of my therapy notes from the NHS. Each one carries the same message on the back. We know what you watched. I don't know if it's a threat or just a reminder. I don't know if they want something from me, or if they're simply ensuring I remember what I witnessed. But I've learned that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The worst part isn't the invasion of privacy, or even the constant feeling of being monitored. It's knowing that somewhere out there, that basement with the concrete walls and single bare bulb might still be operating. That other people might be sitting at their computers right now, watching live streams of things that should never happen, placing bets on human suffering like it's a sporting event. And I'm the only one who knows it's real. At least, I hope I'm the only one. It's funny how sometimes the most innocent decisions lead you down the darkest paths. Take my decision to become a night security guard at 34, for instance. I thought I was just taking a quiet job that would give me time to figure out what to do with the rest of my life after the redundancy from the council. Instead, I ended up discovering things about human nature that I wish I could forget. The job was at a small industrial estate in Coventry. Nothing glamorous, just a collection of warehouses and small manufacturing units that needed someone to walk around with a torch and make sure nobody was nicking anything. 12-hour shifts, 4 nights a week, decent pay for essentially doing nothing but staying awake and occasionally checking that doors were still locked. The site office had a proper security setup. Banks of monitors showing feeds from cameras dotted around the estate, a comfortable chair, and most importantly, a decent internet connection. Management had made it clear that as long as I did my hourly rounds and filed the incident reports, what I did with the rest of my time was my business. Perfect for someone trying to work out their next career move. Those first few weeks, I spent the quiet hours browsing job sites and updating my CV, but there's only so much career planning you can do at 3 in the morning before your brain starts craving something more stimulating. That's when I discovered online communities for night shift workers. Forums where security guards, hospital porters, warehouse staff, and various other nocturnal workers would gather to share stories and keep each other company during the long, empty hours. It was through one of these communities that I first heard about the deeper parts of the internet. Not the obvious stuff that makes headlines, drug markets, and identity theft, but the more obscure corners where people gathered to discuss things that wouldn't be tolerated on mainstream platforms. Privacy advocates, political dissidents, people who valued anonymity above all else. The appeal was obvious. After spending most of my adult life in local government, where every email was monitored and every website visit was logged, the idea of browsing the internet without leaving digital footprints felt liberating. Like taking off a suit of armor you'd been wearing so long you'd forgotten it was there. The technical side wasn't as complicated as I'd expected. There were guides, tutorials, entire communities dedicated to helping newcomers navigate safely. Within a few nights, I had access to a parallel internet that existed alongside the one most people knew about, invisible and unregulated. Most of it was surprisingly mundane. Forums discussing philosophy and politics, marketplaces selling legal but hard-to-find items, communities of people who simply preferred to communicate without corporate oversight. The criminal element was there certainly, but it felt more like a small part of a much larger ecosystem, rather than the dominant feature the media made it out to be. It was during my third week of exploration that I stumbled across the discussion about live streaming. Someone in a privacy forum had posted a technical question about bandwidth requirements for real-time video over encrypted networks. The conversation that followed was academic in tone, but disturbing in content. They were discussing the feasibility of broadcasting live events to paying audiences without law enforcement being able to trace the source. Red rooms were mentioned only in passing, dismissed by most participants as urban legends that didn't match the technical realities of anonymous streaming. But one poster disagreed, claiming they'd encountered legitimate examples hidden deep within invitation-only networks. They refused to provide details, but something about their matter-of-fact tone suggested they weren't making it up. That comment stayed with me over the following nights. During my hourly rounds, walking between empty warehouses with only my torch for company, I found myself thinking about what might be happening in other buildings, in other cities, in other countries, places where people gathered to watch things that should never be filmed, let alone broadcast to paying customers. The search took longer than I'd expected. Every obvious lead turned out to be a scam or a honeypot. The deeper I dug, the more sophisticated the gatekeeping became. This wasn't just about knowing the right websites. It was about establishing credibility within communities that valued secrecy above all else. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. I'd been helping moderate a forum for night shift workers. Nothing dramatic, just removing spam and settling the occasional disagreement, when I received a private message from someone I'd never interacted with before. They claimed to appreciate my contributions to the community and wondered if I'd be interested in discussing more sensitive topics in a private channel. The conversation that followed was careful, coded, full of references I didn't understand, and questions designed to test my knowledge and intentions. Gradually, it became clear that they were evaluating whether I could be trusted with access to something most people would never see. The invitation, when it finally came, was for a private network that existed several layers deeper than anything I'd encountered before. Access was limited to verified members only, with new users requiring sponsorship from existing participants. The verification process was extensive. Proof of identity, background checks, even references from other members who could vouch for your discretion. It took nearly 2 months to gain full access, and by then I wasn't entirely sure I wanted it anymore. But curiosity had become compulsion, and the same methodical approach that had served me well in local government carried me through the final stages of the approval process. The private network was smaller than I'd expected, maybe 100 active users at most, but the content was unlike anything I'd seen before. They called themselves documentarians, claiming to preserve authentic human experiences that would otherwise go unrecorded. But the experiences they were interested in documenting were things most people would never want to see. The Red Room section was hidden within a subsection marked Live Archives. 3 different providers, each claiming to offer unscripted real-time content featuring genuine participants. The language was clinical, designed to maintain plausible deniability, while making the actual service clear to interested viewers. I spent weeks researching the providers before making contact with one. Their operation appeared professional. Encrypted communications, scheduled sessions, technical support for viewers having connection issues. They operated more like a legitimate streaming service than the criminal enterprise I'd expected. The booking process was surprisingly straightforward. Payment handled through an escrow system that provided guarantees for both parties. I was provided with connection details and technical requirements for a session scheduled for the following Thursday at 2 in the morning. When the time came, I found myself sitting in the security office, surrounded by monitors showing empty car parks and darkened warehouses, about to witness something I knew would change how I saw the world. The session began promptly at the scheduled time, connecting me to a live stream that took several minutes to stabilize through the encrypted network. The video quality was poor but functional, showing what appeared to be a small, windowless room with concrete walls. A single chair sat in the center, currently empty, while cameras captured the space from multiple angles. A chat interface allowed communication with other viewers, though the messages were sparse and cryptic. For the first 20 minutes, nothing happened. Just an empty room occasionally flickering as the stream quality adjusted. I was beginning to wonder if this was some kind of performance art, when a figure appeared at the edge of the frame. The man who entered was unremarkable, middle-aged, wearing simple clothing, moving with the casual confidence of someone in familiar surroundings. He spent several minutes adjusting equipment I couldn't see clearly, occasionally glancing at the camera as if checking the feed quality. Then he left, and we were back to watching an empty room. The waiting was almost worse than what came next. Other viewers were using the chat to place bets, make requests, discuss payment options for specific outcomes. I realized I was witnessing something that existed at the intersection of entertainment and crime, where the audience was complicit in whatever was about to happen. When the door opened again, there were two figures. The same man as before, now accompanied by someone much younger. A woman, early 20s perhaps, who seemed confused about where she was or how she'd gotten there. She looked around the room with growing alarm, taking in the cameras and bare walls and single chair with obvious distress. The chat exploded with activity. Dozens of messages appearing faster than I could read them. Viewers making suggestions and placing bets on what would happen next. Bitcoin addresses were being shared. Payments arranged in real time. I watched in horrified fascination as what I was witnessing transformed from observation into participation. The man guided the woman to the chair with gentle but firm insistence. She kept looking directly at the cameras, as if trying to understand what they were recording. Her expression shifted from confusion to fear as the reality of her situation became clear. I should have closed the browser immediately, should have reported what I was seeing, though I had no idea how to explain where I'd found it or whether anyone would believe me. Instead, I found myself paralyzed, unable to look away from something I knew was fundamentally wrong. The man began responding to requests from the chat. He would pause, read something on a screen I couldn't see, then nod or make adjustments to whatever he was preparing. The audience was directing the performance, choosing what happened next through their messages and payments. Then something changed. The steady stream of chat messages stopped abruptly, replaced by a series of warnings from different users. Abort session, abort session, abort session. The man looked directly at the camera, his expression shifting from professional calm to genuine alarm. He moved quickly to something off-screen, and within seconds the video feed cut out entirely. I stared at a blank screen showing only a connection error message. When I tried to reload the page, the entire site was gone. The private network, the forums, even my access credentials, everything had vanished as if it had never existed. Over the following days, I tried to convince myself that what I'd witnessed had been elaborate fiction, a performance designed to extract money from people curious about the darker corners of human nature. The production quality could have been achieved with basic equipment, and everything I'd seen could have been staged by competent actors. But I kept thinking about those final moments before the stream ended. The way the man's demeanor had changed when he'd seen those warning messages. The speed with which everything had shut down. It felt less like a show ending and more like an emergency evacuation. 2 weeks later, I noticed the van. It was parked across from the industrial estate entrance when I arrived for my shift on Tuesday night. Nothing unusual about that. People parked there regularly to use the cash machine at the petrol station next door. But this van was still there when I did my first round at midnight, and again at 1 o'clock, and again at 2. Through the security office windows, I could see it clearly in the light from the street lamps. Dark blue, no markings, windows tinted too dark to see inside. Just sitting there, facing the estate entrance, as if whoever was inside was watching for something, or someone. The van was there for 3 consecutive nights before it disappeared. During that time, I noticed other things. Cars that seemed to follow the same route past the estate at regular intervals. A jogger who ran the same circuit at 3:30 every morning, always glancing towards the security office as they passed. Small anomalies that individually meant nothing but together suggested a pattern. On the Friday night, after the van had finally gone, I received an email at my personal account. The sender was anonymous, the subject line blank. The message contained only a single line of text. "We know what you watched." Below that was an attachment, a photograph taken through the security office window, showing me sitting at the desk with my laptop open. The image was clear enough to make out details of the screen, though not clear enough to see exactly what I'd been viewing. I deleted the email immediately and ran every security scan I could think of. Changed all my passwords, cleared my browsing history, even formatted the laptop's hard drive. But the damage was already done. Whoever had sent that message had been close enough to photograph me through the office window without triggering any of the motion sensors around the building. That was 6 months ago. I've changed jobs since then. Couldn't concentrate on the security work after that. Kept seeing suspicious vehicles that probably weren't there and hearing footsteps that were likely just the building settling. I work days now, in an office with other people around, where everything feels safer and more predictable. But I still get emails occasionally, never more than once a month, always from different anonymous addresses. Sometimes it's another photograph, my car in the supermarket car park, my flat building taken from across the street, me walking to work on Tuesday morning. Once, it was a copy of my employment records from the security company. Each one carries the same message. "We know what you watched." I don't know what they want from me. Money, silence, complicity. None of it would surprise me at this point. But I've learned that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. And some audiences never stop watching, even after the show has ended. The thing that bothers me most isn't the surveillance or even the constant feeling of being monitored. It's knowing that somewhere out there, in windowless rooms with concrete walls and multiple cameras, things are still happening that should never be filmed. That people are still gathering online to watch and direct and pay for experiences that exist at the furthest edges of human cruelty. And now I'm part of it, whether I want to be or not. A witness who can't testify. A viewer who can't unsee. Connected forever to something I stumbled across during the long, quiet hours of a night shift in Coventry. Sometimes I wonder if that was always the plan. If the whole thing, the forums, the invitations, the careful vetting process, was designed not just to provide entertainment for paying customers, but to create a network of compromised witnesses, People who'd seen too much to ever feel completely safe again. People like me, who now understand that the worst monsters aren't hiding under beds or lurking in dark alleys. They're sitting in rooms just like the one I'm in now, watching screens that show things no human being should ever have to see. Have you ever been in the situation where you do something seemingly normal, something routine, and it completely changes your life? I'm curious, what would you do if you took your laptop in for a simple repair and end up discovering that the ordinary-looking guy in the computer shop is involved in things that would make your worst nightmares seem tame? That the person fixing your webcam issue has been using that same webcam to watch you for months? I work as a teaching assistant at a primary school in Coventry. There's nothing particularly exciting about my life. I help 7-year-olds with their reading, supervise playtime, and assist the main teachers with various administrative tasks. The pay isn't brilliant, but I enjoy working with children and the holidays are decent. Last autumn, my laptop started acting up. The webcam would activate randomly, the little green light flickering on for a few seconds before switching off again. Sometimes I'd catch it happening while I was using the computer. Other times I'd notice it had been on when I returned from making tea or using the bathroom. Initially, I assumed it was a software glitch. Ran virus scans, updated drivers, tried all the usual troubleshooting steps you find online. Nothing worked. If anything, the problem seemed to be getting worse. The camera would activate more frequently, sometimes staying on for several minutes at a time. Eventually, I decided to take it to a local repair shop. The place was called Digital Solutions and occupied a narrow storefront between a charity shop and a kebab restaurant. I'd walked past it hundreds of times but never really noticed it before. The kind of business that blends into the background of everyday urban life. The owner was a middle-aged man named Trevor, who seemed knowledgeable about computers and quoted reasonable prices for the repair work. He explained that webcam issues were common, usually caused by corrupted drivers or malware infections. Said he'd need to keep the laptop for a few days to run comprehensive diagnostics and clean up the system. I dropped it off on a Wednesday morning and was told it would be ready by the weekend. Trevor provided a receipt and assured me that all customer data would remain private and secure during the repair process. That evening, I realized how much I relied on my laptop for basic activities, checking emails, browsing social media, watching streaming services before bed. Without it, I found myself with unexpectedly free time and nothing particular to do with it. On Thursday evening, I decided to walk past the shop to see if it was still open. The storefront was dark, but I could see light coming from what appeared to be a back office or workshop area. Trevor was working late, presumably fixing computers like mine. As I walked past, something caught my attention. Through the window, I could see multiple computer screens displaying what looked like video feeds. Not the typical desktop view you'd expect from computer repair work, but actual video streams showing various rooms and locations. I slowed down to get a better look, trying to appear casual while examining what was visible through the window. The video feeds showed different domestic spaces, bedrooms, living rooms, home offices. Most appeared to be empty, though a few showed people going about their normal evening routines. My first thought was that Trevor might be running some sort of security monitoring service alongside his computer repair business. Many small business owners take on multiple revenue streams to make ends meet. Nothing particularly suspicious about that. But something felt off about what I was seeing. The camera angles were wrong for professional security installations. Too intimate, too focused on private spaces rather than entry points or valuable items. These looked more like hidden cameras than security systems. I continued walking, but the image of those video feeds stayed with me. That night, I found myself wondering about my own laptop, about the webcam issues I'd been experiencing, about how long Trevor had been aware of the problem before I brought the computer to his shop. On Friday, I called to check on the repair progress. Trevor said the work was taking longer than expected, that he'd discovered more extensive malware infections than initially apparent. He'd need the weekend to complete the cleaning process, but the laptop would definitely be ready by Monday. This gave me an excuse to walk past the shop again Friday evening. Same pattern as the night before, dark storefront, lights in the back office, multiple screens displaying video feeds of domestic spaces. This time, I counted at least 6 different feeds visible through the window. One of them showed a young woman in what appeared to be her bedroom, getting ready for bed. The camera angle suggested it was positioned somewhere high up, possibly hidden in a ceiling fixture or ventilation grate. She had no idea she was being watched. Another feed showed a family watching television in their living room. 2 adults, 3 children, completely unaware that their private evening was being broadcast to Trevor's monitoring setup. The camera quality was good enough to make out facial features and read text on the television screen. I realized I was looking at a surveillance operation, not a security service. These were people being watched without their knowledge or consent, probably through compromised webcams in devices they'd brought to Trevor for repair, devices like my laptop. When I collected my computer on Monday, Trevor was friendly and professional, explained that he'd removed several malware infections and updated all the security software, said the webcam issues should be completely resolved, and provided documentation of all the work he'd performed. I paid the repair fee and took the laptop home, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with the entire situation. That evening, I covered the webcam with electrical tape and began researching how to detect covert surveillance software. The diagnostic tools I downloaded found several programs I didn't recognize, applications that weren't listed in the standard software inventory, but were definitely present on the system. Most appeared to be related to remote access and file sharing, the kind of software that could allow someone to control a computer from a distance. I spent the next several days learning about digital forensics, about how to trace network connections and monitor system activity. What I discovered was disturbing. My laptop was regularly connecting to IP addresses I didn't recognize, uploading small amounts of data at consistent intervals. The connection logs showed that these uploads had been happening for months, long before I'd taken the computer to Trevor for repair. But the frequency and volume of data transfer had increased significantly since getting the laptop back from his shop. I started documenting everything. Screenshots of the network activity, records of the suspicious software installations, photos of Trevor's shop taken from the street. Built a comprehensive file of evidence, though I wasn't sure what I planned to do with it. That's when I decided to investigate Trevor's operation more thoroughly. Started walking past his shop at different times, observing patterns in his work schedule and customer traffic. Noticed that he seemed to specialize in devices with cameras, laptops, tablets, smartphones with front-facing cameras. Most of his customers appeared to be ordinary people dealing with routine technical problems. Students with slow computers, parents with virus-infected family laptops, elderly people who'd accidentally installed malicious software. All of them trusting Trevor to fix their problems and protect their privacy. One evening, I saw something that changed my understanding of what Trevor was actually running. Through the back office window, I could see him interacting with what appeared to be a live streaming interface. Multiple video feeds were active, but now there was chat functionality alongside the video streams. People were watching the feeds and commenting in real time. Not just watching, but requesting specific actions or camera angles. Trevor was responding to these requests, apparently controlling which feeds were visible and how the surveillance was conducted. This wasn't just unauthorized monitoring. This was a commercial operation, selling access to private surveillance footage to paying customers around the world. I recognized one of the video feeds immediately. It showed a bedroom that looked exactly like mine, filmed from the angle where my laptop usually sat on the dresser. The electrical tape I'd placed over the webcam was visible in the corner of the frame, but the camera was somehow still transmitting video from inside my flat. Trevor had installed multiple surveillance devices during the repair process. The webcam issue I'd originally brought to him was probably his doing in the first place, a way to identify potential surveillance targets and get access to their devices. I left the area immediately and went home to search my flat thoroughly. Found a tiny camera hidden in the smoke detector above my bed, another one built into what looked like a standard electrical outlet near my desk. Professional installations, nearly invisible unless you knew exactly what to look for. The devices were connected to my home Wi-Fi network, probably configured during Trevor's access to my laptop and password information. They'd been broadcasting footage of my private life to his streaming platform for weeks, maybe months. I documented everything with my phone camera, then carefully removed the surveillance devices without damaging them, kept them as evidence, along with all the digital forensics information I'd gathered about the compromised laptop. But when I tried to report the situation to police, I encountered a problem I hadn't anticipated. The officers I spoke with seemed knowledgeable about traditional crimes, but struggled to understand the technical aspects of what I was describing. Digital surveillance, dark web streaming platforms, cryptocurrency payment systems. It was outside their normal area of expertise. They took my statement and collected the physical evidence, but explained that investigating this type of cybercrime would require specialist resources that might not be available immediately. Said they'd be in touch once they'd consulted with their digital forensics team. That was 4 months ago. I've heard nothing back from police, and Trevor's shop is still operating normally. Same storefront, same repair services, same trusting customers bringing their camera-equipped devices to be fixed. I moved to a different flat across town, replaced all my electronic devices, took comprehensive security precautions to prevent future surveillance. But moving doesn't change what you know, and the knowledge of what Trevor is doing follows me through every ordinary day. The worst part isn't knowing that I was watched without consent. The worst part is understanding how many other people are probably being watched right now. People who trust their local computer repair shop to fix their problems and protect their privacy. Trevor's operation depends on that trust, on people like me who need technical help and assume that small business owners are fundamentally honest. On the invisibility that comes with running a boring, everyday service that nobody pays much attention to. I've started noticing other computer repair shops around the city, wondering how many of them might be running similar operations. How many ordinary-looking technicians are actually surveillance entrepreneurs, selling access to private footage through dark web streaming platforms. Sometimes I wonder if reporting Trevor to police was the right decision, or if I should have tried to expose his operation through other means. Media attention, social media campaigns, direct warnings to his potential victims. But all of these approaches would require evidence that I'm not sure I could provide without admitting to my own illegal surveillance of his activities. That's the genius of operations like Trevor's. They create witnesses who are bound by their own complicity, people who can't report what they've seen without acknowledging their own borderline criminal behavior. I've never told anyone else about this experience. Not colleagues, not friends, not family members. What would I say? That my computer repair guy was running a surveillance operation and I discovered it by spying on his business. That I removed hidden cameras from my own flat, but can't prove where they came from. But I'm telling you now, and I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe because the weight of keeping it secret has become too much. Maybe because sharing it might somehow make it less real, less immediate, less present in my daily thoughts. Or maybe because I've started to suspect that creating witnesses was always part of Trevor's business model. That people like me who discover what he's doing are meant to discover it. Meant to carry the knowledge forward through stories that can never be properly verified. Maybe the real product isn't just the surveillance footage, but the awareness that such surveillance is possible. The understanding that any electronic device could be compromised, that any repair technician could be more than they appear to be. Trevor is still operating his shop, still fixing computers and installing surveillance equipment, still running his streaming platform for customers around the world. And somewhere in Coventry, other people are probably walking past his storefront right now, thinking about getting their webcam issues fixed by a friendly, knowledgeable local businessman. Maybe by telling you this, I'm doing exactly what Trevor's operation requires to survive and spread. Creating awareness, planting seeds of paranoia, making people more conscious of the surveillance possibilities that exist in their ordinary digital lives. Maybe that's how these things work. Not just through the technical infrastructure of hidden cameras and streaming platforms, but through the social infrastructure of witnesses who carry the knowledge forward, who ensure that the awareness of such possibilities becomes part of the general consciousness. I still work at the primary school, still help children with their reading, still live a fundamentally ordinary life. But now I understand that ordinary life exists alongside operations like Trevor's, that the surface of everyday business conceals activities that most people never imagine are happening. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone in my new flat with my new laptop, I find myself wondering if Trevor was really working alone, or if he was part of something larger. A network of repair shops and surveillance operations, all feeding content to the same streaming platforms, all serving the same global audience of people who pay to watch strangers in their most private moments. That might be the most disturbing possibility of all. Not that one creepy computer repair guy was running a surveillance operation, but that such operations are common enough to sustain entire industries, entire ecosystems of people who make their living by violating the privacy of ordinary people who just needed their laptops fixed. Imagine discovering that someone has been watching you through your bedroom window for months, filming your most private moments, and selling the footage online to strangers. Now imagine that this isn't happening to just you, but to thousands of people across the country, probably the world, all completely unaware that their lives have become entertainment for perverts with deep pockets. The worst part? It's not some far-fetched nightmare scenario. It's happening right now. I stumbled across it by accident, if you can call 3 months of deliberate searching an accident. I was writing my dissertation on digital privacy and anonymity networks for my media studies degree at Manchester. Proper academic research, you understand. I wasn't some basement dweller looking for thrills. I had ethics approval forms and everything. The Tor browser had been running on my laptop for weeks. I'd bookmarked the usual suspects, a few cannabis marketplaces, some forums discussing encryption, the odd political dissent site. Standard fare for someone studying how people communicate when they don't want to be watched. My supervisor, Dr. Chen, had given me a reading list of academic papers about online anonymity, but I wanted primary sources, real examples. That's how I found the link. It was buried in a forum post about internet freedom, sandwiched between complaints about government surveillance and discussions of VPN protocols. Just a string of random characters ending in .onion with a single word underneath. Rooms. The site took ages to load. That's normal on Tor. Everything crawls along at the speed of dial-up. When it finally appeared, it looked like something from the early days of the internet. Black background, green text, no images. Just a list of what looked like chat room names, each with a number next to it. The numbers were small, usually single digits. I clicked on one called Yorkshire Evening. The page that loaded had a simple interface, a text box at the bottom, a larger window above showing messages. But there were no messages, just a counter at the top showing 3 viewers and a button that said Request Access. I sat there for about 10 minutes, watching the viewer count fluctuate between 2 and 5. Nothing else happened. No messages appeared, no instructions. Just that green text on black and the gentle hum of my laptop fan. It felt like standing outside a shop with blacked out windows, knowing people were inside but unable to see what they were doing. I tried a few other rooms. Same setup, viewer counts, empty chat windows, that request access button. The names were mundane enough. Brighton Pier, Camden Market, Sunday Roast. They could have been tourism websites or local community groups, but something about the whole thing felt wrong. The way the viewer numbers changed constantly, as if people were flicking between rooms, watching, waiting. After about an hour, I closed the browser and went back to my dissertation. I had enough material about dark web marketplaces and didn't need to go down whatever rabbit hole that site represented. Dr. Chen would be pleased with my chapter on cryptocurrency adoption in illegal markets. That was proper academic work. But I kept thinking about those rooms, the way they just sat there, empty but watched. Over the next few days, I found myself opening the site again, checking the viewer counts, watching the numbers change. It became a habit, like checking social media or the weather. A few minutes here and there between writing chapters and attending seminars. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday evening. I'd been working late in the university library, and when I got back to my flat in Fallowfield, I opened the site almost without thinking. The viewer count on Yorkshire Evening was higher than usual, nearly 20 people, and for the first time, there were messages in the chat window. They weren't conversation exactly, more like coordinates, times and dates, grid references. Someone had posted 53.4 degrees north, 2.2 degrees west, Thursday, 23:30. And others were responding with single words. Confirmed. Watching. Ready. I recognized those coordinates. They were for somewhere in Manchester city centre, near the cathedral, about 15 minutes from where I was sitting. The rational part of my brain knew I should close the browser and forget about it. These were clearly people planning something, and coordinates with specific times suggested it wasn't just chat. But the researcher in me was curious. What were they planning? Was this some kind of urban exploration group? A photography meetup? The coordinates were for a public area. What could they possibly be doing there that required such secrecy? Thursday came and went. I didn't go to the coordinates, but I couldn't stop thinking about them. I found myself checking the news for incidents in Manchester city centre, scanning local police Twitter accounts for anything unusual. Nothing appeared. Whatever had happened, if anything, hadn't made the news. The following week, new coordinates appeared, this time for Liverpool, then Birmingham, always a major city, always with that same pattern of confirmations and single-word responses. I started keeping a notebook, writing down the coordinates and times, not because I planned to do anything with them, but because documenting patterns is what researchers do. The pattern was monthly, third Thursday of each month, around 11:30 at night. Always city centres, always near major landmarks or transport hubs. The coordinates were precise, not just somewhere in Birmingham, but specific to within a few meters. After 3 months of watching, I decided to visit one of the locations. Not during the appointed time, obviously. I wasn't stupid. But I wanted to see what was there, what might draw these people to those specific spots. The coordinates for that month were for a location near Liverpool Street Station in London. Easy enough to visit during the day under the pretense of legitimate research. The location was a small side street off the main road, narrow, with old Victorian buildings that had been converted into flats above shops. During the day, it was busy enough. People cutting through to avoid the crowds on the main street. Workers from nearby offices grabbing lunch. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would explain why someone would choose to meet there at 11:30 on a Thursday night. But as I walked down the street, I noticed something odd. Several of the buildings had small security cameras mounted on the walls. Not the usual CCTV you see everywhere in London, but smaller, more discreet ones. They were angled to cover the street from different positions, creating overlapping fields of view. It struck me that you'd have very comprehensive coverage of anyone walking down that street. I went back to Manchester and thought about what I'd seen. Coordinates, confirmations, a location with extensive camera coverage. It was starting to form a picture I didn't like. The next month, I made a decision that I still regret. I went to the Manchester location at the appointed time. It was raining that Thursday night, the kind of fine drizzle that soaks through your jacket without you noticing. I'd positioned myself about 50 meters from the coordinates in the doorway of a closed shop, where I could see the street but remain hidden. I told myself I was just observing, that I'd leave at the first sign of anything dodgy. At 11:20, a figure appeared at the far end of the street. They walked slowly, deliberately, checking something on their phone. At 5:25, another person arrived from the opposite direction. They didn't acknowledge each other, but both stopped near the exact coordinates I'd written down. By 11:30, there were 5 people standing in roughly the same area. None of them spoke. They just stood there, occasionally glancing around or checking their phones. I was beginning to think this was the most boring conspiracy I'd ever witnessed when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Each of them was holding a small device, something about the size of a smartphone, but with what looked like a small lens on one end. And they were all pointing these devices in the same direction, toward the residential buildings that lined the street. I followed their gaze and saw what they were looking at. In one of the upper floor windows, there was a light on. Just a normal household light. But in the window, I could see the silhouette of someone moving around. Someone who had no idea they were being watched. The group stood there for exactly 30 minutes. Then, without any signal I could detect, they all began to walk away in different directions. The whole thing had taken place in complete silence. I waited until they were all gone before I walked home. My hands were shaking as I unlocked my front door. I just witnessed something that felt deeply wrong, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. a group of people with cameras watching someone's flat. It could have been innocent, amateur photographers, urban explorers, even researchers like myself. But the secrecy, the coordinates, the synchronized timing, none of that suggested innocent activity. The next day, I went back to the dark website. The viewer count for Yorkshire Evening was back to normal levels, but there was new activity in the chat. People were posting what looked like file names: MCR2311, window4.mp4, MCR2311, kitchen2.ave. The files were followed by strings of numbers and letters, Bitcoin wallet addresses. I realized I was looking at a marketplace. The coordinates weren't meeting points for urban exploration or photography. They were organized surveillance sessions. People were gathering to film strangers in their homes and then selling the footage online. That was disturbing enough. But as I dug deeper into the site, I found something worse. Some of the room names weren't locations at all. They were what looked like names or descriptions. Red hair student, night shift nurse, single mum bedtime. These weren't random voyeurism sessions. They were targeted. Someone was identifying specific individuals and organizing groups to film them. The Bitcoin addresses suggested people were paying for custom content. I felt sick. This wasn't academic research anymore. I'd stumbled into something that was actively harming real people. People who had no idea they were being watched, filmed, and potentially stalked. The rational thing would have been to contact the police, but what would I tell them? That I'd found a website on the dark web where people might be doing something illegal? That I'd witnessed a group of people standing on a street corner with cameras? I had no proof of wrongdoing, no evidence that actual crimes were being committed. Instead, I tried to dig deeper. I wanted to understand the scale of what I'd found, to gather enough evidence to make a proper report. I started monitoring the site more systematically, documenting the patterns, screenshotting the conversations. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. The site wasn't just organizing surveillance. It was a complete ecosystem. People would post requests, descriptions of individuals they wanted filmed. Others would volunteer to do the filming. The footage would be edited and sold. There were even reviews and ratings for the people doing the filming. But the most disturbing part was how organized it all was. This wasn't a few perverts with cameras. There were hundreds of people involved, maybe thousands. The Bitcoin transactions suggested serious money was changing hands. Someone was running this as a business, and the targets weren't random. They were often vulnerable people, students living alone, single parents, people working night shifts. The kind of people who might not notice if someone was watching their flat, or who might not be believed if they reported feeling like they were being stalked. I started having trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought about those silhouettes in windows, people going about their evening routines, while strangers with cameras watched from the street below. I began checking my own windows obsessively, making sure the curtains were closed, looking for unusual activity outside. The paranoia was probably irrational. I lived in a shared house with 3 other students. We were on the ground floor with a small front garden that would make surveillance difficult. But knowing what I knew about how these people operated, I couldn't shake the feeling that I might be next. That's when I noticed the van. It was parked on my street when I got home from university on a Friday afternoon. Nothing unusual about that. Parking was always tight in our area. But it was still there when I left for the pub that evening, and when I came back around midnight. The next morning, it had moved to a different spot, but it was still on the same street. I probably wouldn't have thought anything of it if not for what I'd learned about the surveillance network. But once you know how these things work, you start seeing patterns everywhere. The van was always positioned where it had a clear view of our house. The windows were tinted, so you couldn't see inside, and it moved regularly, just enough to avoid drawing attention. I started taking photos of it, documenting when it appeared and where it parked. I even walked past it a few times, trying to see if anyone was inside. But the windows were too dark, and I didn't want to be too obvious about looking. After a week of this, I convinced myself I was being paranoid. The van probably belonged to someone who worked in the area or was visiting a friend. I was letting what I'd discovered online affect my perception of reality. That's what happens when you spend too much time staring into the dark corners of the internet. But then I found my address in the site's chat logs. It was buried in a conversation about Manchester targets, listed alongside 2 other addresses in my area. Someone had posted it with a description that matched my appearance and mentioned my university. They knew where I lived, what I looked like, and where I studied. The worst part was the response. Other users were bidding for the surveillance job, offering to provide footage within the week. The highest bid was nearly £200. I'd gone from researcher to target without realizing it. Someone had identified me, probably through my digital footprint, and put me up for sale on their surveillance marketplace. The van outside my house wasn't paranoia. It was reconnaissance. I packed a bag and left Manchester that night, told my housemates I had a family emergency and would be gone for a few weeks. I drove to my parents' house in Chester and stayed there for a month, claiming I needed to focus on my dissertation without distractions. During that time, I tried to report what I'd found to the police. I called the non-emergency number and explained about the dark website and the surveillance network. The officer I spoke to was polite, but clearly didn't understand the technical aspects of what I was describing. He took down my details and said someone would get back to me, but no one ever did. I tried contacting some of the cybercrime units, but without concrete evidence of specific crimes, they weren't interested. What I'd found was disturbing, but it existed in a legal grey area. Standing on public streets with cameras isn't illegal. Selling footage of people in their homes might be, but proving that was happening would require an investigation that no one seemed willing to undertake. Eventually, I had to go back to Manchester to finish my degree. I changed my address, moving to a different part of the city. I bought thick curtains for all my windows and developed a habit of checking the street before leaving my flat. The van never reappeared, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. I finished my dissertation on a completely different topic. Dr. Chen was disappointed that I'd moved away from my original research into dark web marketplaces, but I told him I'd found the subject too depressing to continue with. He probably thought I was being oversensitive. The surveillance site is still online. I check it occasionally, using different computers and IP addresses, just to see if it's still active. It is. The room names change, the coordinates shift to different cities, but the pattern continues. People gathering to film strangers, selling the footage to whoever wants to buy it. Sometimes I think about the person I saw in that window in Manchester, the silhouette moving around their flat, completely unaware that 5 people were standing in the street below, recording their every movement. I wonder if they ever found out. I wonder if they ever felt that creeping sensation that someone was watching them, or if they just went about their life, never knowing that their privacy had been violated and sold to strangers online. The thing that disturbs me most isn't the surveillance itself, although that's bad enough. It's how organized it all is, how many people are involved, how much money is changing hands. What I found wasn't some small group of perverts with cameras. It was an industry, and if they could identify me from my digital footprint, if they could find my address and put me up for sale on their marketplace, then they can do the same to anyone. Your address might already be on one of those sites. Someone might already be bidding for footage of you going about your daily routine. You'll probably never know. That's the worst part. You'll never know if that van parked outside your house is just a van, or if someone inside is watching you through tinted windows. You'll never know if that person lingering on the street corner is just waiting for a bus, or if they're pointing a camera at your bedroom window. You'll never know, but now you'll always wonder. And that's exactly what they want. I remember the rain that night. Not the soft, gentle kind that lulls you to sleep, but the harsh, unrelenting downpour that seems determined to wash away every trace of humanity from the streets. London had been suffering through 3 straight days of this biblical deluge, and I was desperate for a dry place with decent Wi-Fi after my flat's internet had gone down. That's how I found myself pushing through the door of Night Owl, one of those pop-up internet cafes that appear and disappear within months, the kind that exists in that grey area between legitimate business and something else entirely. I should have noticed the warning signs immediately. The blacked out windows, the lack of other customers despite the weather, the way the attendant barely looked at me as he took my cash. £5 for unlimited time, no ID required, no questions asked. I was a university student back then, working on my dissertation about online communities and digital anthropology. I'd been spending months researching the surface web, but my supervisor had hinted that my work lacked depth, that I needed to explore the darker corners of the internet to truly understand the full spectrum of online behavior. Looking back now, I wonder if he knew what he was sending me into, or if he was just another academic who thought the dark web was merely an interesting theoretical concept rather than the nightmare I was about to experience. The cafe had about 12 stations, each isolated from the others by tall, opaque dividers. Privacy booths, the attendant had called them when I asked. I settled into booth 7, noticing the high-end computer setup. Much better than what you'd typically find in a place charging only £5. The chair was surprisingly comfortable, the keyboard mechanical and responsive. It felt like a setup designed for extended use, not casual browsing. I'd done my homework before venturing into the dark web, downloaded Tor, learned about OPSEC, read countless Reddit threads from people claiming to have explored the hidden services. I thought I was prepared. I thought I was being cautious. I remember thinking how silly all those horror stories seemed now that I was actually doing it. Just another internet connection, just another browser, just different websites. Nothing to be afraid of if you were smart about it. The first hour or so was exactly what I expected. Linked directories, forums discussing privacy, some marketplaces selling things that would make your average high street shopper raise an eyebrow, but nothing that shocked me. I took notes diligently, occasionally glancing around the empty cafe, relieved to have the place to myself. The rain continued to batter the windows, creating a white noise that almost made the environment cozy despite the harsh fluorescent lighting. Then, just as I was considering packing up, satisfied with my initial exploration, a message popped up in the corner of the screen. Not an email or a chat window that I'd opened, just text appearing directly on my desktop. The message mentioned something about Booth 7, always bringing in curious ones. I felt that initial spike of adrenaline, that primal response telling me something wasn't right. But I rationalized it immediately. The cafe must monitor their systems. The attendant had probably noticed me accessing Tor and was having a laugh. Perhaps Perhaps this was even some kind of automated message triggered by certain browsing patterns. I ignored it and continued browsing, clicking through to a forum discussing digital anonymity. Another message appeared, saying they'd been watching me and asking if I wanted to see something real, mentioning Booth 7 was ready for a player. I should have left then. I should have gathered my things, walked out into the rain, and never looked back. Instead, I found myself typing a response, curiosity overwhelming caution. I simply asked who it was. The response was immediate. Some group called Run the Gauntlet, saying I was on their network and my session had been selected. Before I could respond, my browser closed itself and reopened, displaying a black page with a simple interface, a video player in the center, a chat sidebar on the right, and what looked like a scoreboard on the left showing numbers. The video feed showed an empty room with bare concrete walls, a table, and a single chair. The lighting was harsh, industrial. It looked like a basement, or perhaps an abandoned industrial space. At this point, I tried to close the browser, but nothing happened. I tried Ctrl-Alt-Delete, but the system didn't respond. I reached for the power button on the tower, but it was locked behind some kind of case. I considered simply walking out, but something held me there. Academic curiosity, morbid fascination, or perhaps just the paralysis of fear beginning to take hold. The chat sidebar was active with messages scrolling by too quickly to read properly, but I caught fragments about a new player in Booth 7, an unwitting participant, something about a London node being active, and starting bids at £5,000. Whilst I was still processing what I was seeing, a man entered the frame of the video. He wore a balaclava and spoke directly to the camera in accented English. I couldn't place the accent precisely. Eastern European, perhaps. He explained the situation without emotion, like he was reading a weather report. I was now part of a real-time game, selected because of my browsing patterns and location. Booth 7, he explained, was their London gateway, and tonight I wasn't just an observer, but a participant. The rules were simple and terrifying. A variation of Russian roulette. 6 players, 6 rounds. Each round, players would be randomly selected to face the gun. Those who survived would continue to the next round. Those who didn't, well, the implication was clear, without needing elaboration. The winners would walk away with their lives and a share of the money being bet on them by viewers. I was player 6, he informed me. The other 5 were in similar booths across different locations: Prague, Berlin, Moscow, Kiev, and Manchester. All of us had stumbled into this network unwittingly. All of us were now locked into our stations. He explained calmly that we couldn't leave until the game was complete. The booths were secured, emergency exits monitored. He even knew the police response time to my location, 11 minutes. The game would take 9. To demonstrate the reality of the situation, he pointed the camera toward a wall where 5 screens showed feeds from other booths. I could see the other participants, a young woman with purple hair frantically trying to get someone's attention outside her booth, a middle-aged man sitting perfectly still as if in shock, a teenager who appeared to be crying, and 2 others who seemed to be trying to break out of their stations. I felt my heart rate accelerating, my palms sweating as I realized the full gravity of what was happening. This wasn't some elaborate prank or digital simulation. The terror on those people's faces was unmistakably real. The first round began. The roulette selected player 3, the teenager, and player 5, a man who looked to be in his 30s. On screen, 2 men in balaclavas approached them, each holding what appeared to be real handguns. They placed the guns against the participants' temples. The chat exploded with activity, spectators placing bets, commenting on the participants' reactions, discussing the odds as if this were just another sporting event. I was watching in numb horror, unable to look away, unable to fully process that this was happening in real time. The countdown began. 3, 2, 1. A hollow click from Player 3's gun. Relief washed over his young face, tears streaming down his cheeks. Player 5 wasn't so fortunate. The sound was deafening even through my speakers, a sharp crack that seemed to reverberate through my entire body. I won't describe what happened next. I can't. Even now, years later, that image is burned into my memory in a way that no amount of therapy has been able to erase. The man in the balaclava returned to the center of the room, casually informing the survivors that round 2 would begin shortly. 1 down, 4 to go. My odds were improving, he noted, with chilling detachment. I was in full panic mode now, looking around desperately for any way out. The dividers between booths reached almost to the ceiling. The door to my booth had no internal handle. I tried shouting for help, but the booth seemed to be soundproofed. My voice felt muffled, contained, as if the air itself was conspiring to silence me. Round 2 began. The selector chose players 1 and 6. My number. My heart felt like it might explode from my chest. On screen, a man approached my booth, visible now on one of the wall monitors. I hadn't even noticed the camera above my station. He was coming for me, and there was nowhere to run. I heard the cafe door open and close, footsteps approaching. I was frantically looking for anything I could use as a weapon, but the booth was minimalist, just the computer, chair, and a small shelf. The footsteps stopped outside my booth. I could see a shadow beneath the door. I pressed myself against the far corner, as if those few extra inches might somehow save me. The door opened, and a man entered, tall, wearing a black coat, his face concealed by a balaclava, just like in the video. In his hand was what looked like a real pistol. He addressed me quietly as Player 6, London Node, telling me it was my turn. He approached slowly, methodically, the gun hanging loosely at his side. I was begging, pleading, offering money, anything. He didn't respond, his eyes visible through the holes in the balaclava, coldly assessing me. Eventually he spoke, his voice almost gentle. "Just a game," he said. "Someone always loses." I closed my eyes as he pressed the cold metal against my temple. In that moment, everything slowed down. I could hear the rain outside, the soft hum of the computer fan, my own ragged breathing. I thought about my parents, how they would never know what happened to me, how I'd become just another missing person statistic. The man counted down. 3, 2, 1. Click. Empty chamber. The relief that flooded through me was almost painful, a physical sensation that made my legs buckle. I slid down the wall to the floor, gasping for air. The man lowered the gun and turned to leave without a word. On screen, Player 1 wasn't as fortunate. Another crack, another life ended for the entertainment of unseen spectators. I won't recount the remaining rounds in detail. Each was a repeat of the same horrific pattern. By some miracle, or perhaps cruel twist of fate, my number didn't come up again. One by one, the other players faced their turns and lost, until only the purple-haired woman and I remained. Final round, the ultimate game. 1 bullet, 2 players. The chat was frenzied now, massive sums being wagered on which of us would walk away. The selector chose Player 6 again. Me. This time, when the door opened, I didn't beg. A strange calm had settled over me, the kind that comes when terror exceeds your capacity to process it. The man raised the gun again. I stared directly into his eyes, refusing to look away, refusing to close my eyes. If this was my end, I would face it. 3, 2, 1. Click. Nothing. Which meant... On screen, I watched as the purple-haired woman's expression shifted from hope to understanding to terror in the space of a heartbeat. The final shot rang out. Game over. The man in my booth lowered his gun. His words were few but clear. I had survived. My session was ending. He left, closing the door behind him. On screen, the host announced me as the winner. The chat exploded with messages, some congratulating, others expressing disappointment, all discussing the event as if it were just entertainment, not the systematic murder of 5 innocent people. The system unlocked. The browser closed itself. The computer returned to its desktop as if nothing had happened. After what felt like hours, but was probably just minutes, I managed to stand on shaking legs and push open the door of the booth. The cafe was empty. The attendant was gone. Even the sign outside had been removed, leaving just a blank storefront. I stumbled out into the rain, which was still falling heavily, now mixing with my tears as I blindly made my way through the streets. I went to the police, of course. They investigated, but found nothing. The building had been rented under a false identity. The computer in booth 7 had been wiped clean, with no evidence of what I'd witnessed. The other locations couldn't be traced. Without evidence, my story sounded like the delusion of a mentally disturbed student who'd spent too much time researching internet horror stories. I tried to find information about the other victims, searching news reports for missing persons matching their descriptions. There were too many possibilities, too many people who disappear without a trace every day. I'll never know who they were. It's been years now. I've tried to move on, to convince myself it was some elaborate hoax or hallucination. But deep down, I know what I saw. Sometimes, when I'm online late at night, I catch myself checking my desktop for unexpected messages. And whenever I pass an internet cafe with privacy booths, I walk quickly to the other side of the street, my heart racing at the memory of booth 7 and the game I never agreed to play. The worst part isn't the nightmares or the constant paranoia. It's the knowledge that somewhere out there Run the Gauntlet is still operating, still selecting unwitting participants, still entertaining those who pay to watch. And every time it rains heavily, I wonder who's sitting in booth 7 tonight. Picture this. You're scrolling through your emails one morning and find an invitation to an exclusive event. Premium location, limited attendance, significant financial reward for participation. The kind of opportunity that seems too good to be true, but legitimate enough that you don't immediately delete it. Now picture discovering that the event isn't what you thought it was, and by the time you realize what you've agreed to, it's far too late to back out. I work in market research for a consultancy firm in Leeds. Nothing glamorous. Consumer surveys, focus groups, the occasional product launch analysis. The pay is decent enough, but it's the kind of job where you're always looking for ways to supplement your income. Freelance work, weekend surveys, anything that might add a few £100s to your monthly earnings. That's why the email caught my attention. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, mixed in with the usual spam and work correspondence. The subject line was simple enough. Research opportunity, exclusive participation required. The sender was someone called Dr. Sarah Chen from something called the Institute for Behavioral Studies. The email was professionally written, explaining that they were conducting a specialized research project on group dynamics and social behavior. They needed participants with specific qualifications, university educated, working in research or analysis, comfortable with technology and unconventional research methods. The compensation was substantial. £500 for a single evening's participation, with the possibility of ongoing work for suitable candidates. I looked up the Institute for Behavioral Studies online. They had a legitimate-looking website, published research papers, even a few academic staff profiles. Dr. Chen appeared to be a real person with proper credentials from Manchester University. Everything seemed above board, if a bit vague about the actual nature of the research. The application process was straightforward. Basic personal information, employment history, some questions about my comfort level with technology, and unusual research scenarios. They asked about my experience with online platforms, whether I'd used secure communication tools, how I felt about observing human behavior in controlled environments. Within a week, I received confirmation that I'd been selected for the study. The details were sparse but intriguing. I would need to attend a briefing session in Manchester, followed by the main research event later that evening. All travel expenses would be covered, plus the £500 participation fee. The only requirement was that I sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement before the briefing. The location was a serviced office building near Manchester city centre. Nothing unusual about that. Lots of research companies rent temporary spaces for focus groups and studies. I arrived on the specified date to find about 20 other people in the waiting area, all roughly my age and background, all looking slightly puzzled about what they'd signed up for. Dr. Chen turned out to be exactly as advertised. A professional academic in her 40s, well-spoken and authoritative. She explained that we would be participating in a study of group behavior and decision-making in high-pressure situations. The research involved observing and interacting with subjects in a controlled environment, measuring our responses to various scenarios. The technology component, she explained, was necessary for participant privacy and research integrity. We would be accessing the observation environment through a secure network, using encrypted connections to ensure anonymity. Each participant would be given a laptop with pre-installed software for the session. We were led to individual workstations in a larger room, each with a laptop and a set of instructions. The software we needed to use was something called Tor browser, which Dr. Chen explained was standard for research requiring participant anonymity. We would be accessing a private research platform that could only be reached through this secure network. The initial briefing made it sound like a sophisticated version of reality television. We would be observing people in various scenarios and making decisions about how situations should develop. Our choices would be aggregated with other participants to determine the direction of the research. It was described as a study of collective decision-making and moral reasoning under pressure. The platform, when we accessed it, looked professional enough. Clean interface, clear instructions, participant guidelines. We were told we would be observing subjects who had volunteered for a separate study and consented to being filmed. Our role was to vote on various scenarios and observe how different situations affected group dynamics. The first session seemed innocuous. We were watching what appeared to be a focus group. 8 people sitting around a table discussing consumer preferences. Our job was to vote on which topics the moderator should introduce next, how the discussion should be guided, what questions would be most revealing about group behavior. It felt like legitimate research, the kind of thing you might see in any market research facility across the country. The participants seemed natural, unaware they were being observed by external researchers. We made our votes through the platform interface, and the focus group moderator would adjust their questioning accordingly. After about an hour, Dr. Chen explained that the next phase would be more intensive. The subjects would be moved to individual observation rooms where we could study their behavior in isolation. This was where the real research would begin, understanding how people behaved when they thought they were alone versus how they acted in groups. The individual observation sessions were more uncomfortable. We were watching people in what looked like small windowless rooms, apparently unaware they were being filmed. The platform allowed us to vote on various environmental changes, adjusting lighting, temperature, introducing background noises. The idea was to measure stress responses and coping mechanisms. I started to feel uneasy about the whole thing. The people we were observing seemed genuinely distressed by some of the environmental changes. When we voted to increase the room temperature, we could see them becoming visibly uncomfortable. When background noise was introduced, they showed clear signs of agitation and confusion. Dr. Chen explained that this was normal for behavioral research. The subjects had consented to psychological stress testing as part of their participation agreement. What we were seeing was valuable data about human resilience and adaptation. The distress was temporary and carefully controlled to avoid lasting harm. But as the evening progressed, the scenarios became more extreme. We were voting on whether to restrict access to water, whether to introduce disturbing sounds, whether to dim the lights to near darkness. The people we were observing were showing increasing signs of panic and distress. The platform interface had evolved too. Instead of simple voting options, we were now bidding on scenarios using virtual credits. The higher the bid, the more likely our chosen option would be implemented. It had turned into a kind of auction system, with participants competing to direct the action. Some of the other participants seemed to be enjoying it. I could hear suppressed laughter from nearby workstations when particularly distressing scenarios were implemented. People were bidding aggressively on options that would cause maximum psychological pressure on the subjects. I tried to bid on less harmful options to counteract what the others were doing, but I quickly realized that some people were bidding with what seemed like unlimited virtual credits. Whatever system was in place, some participants had far more influence than others. The worst part was watching the subject's deterioration. What had started as mild discomfort had escalated to genuine terror. These people were trapped in small rooms, subjected to psychological pressure that was clearly beyond anything they could have consented to. And we were the ones directing it, voting on new ways to torment them. I tried to close the laptop and leave, but Dr. Chen approached my workstation. She explained quietly that participants were required to complete the full session to receive payment. More importantly, the non-disclosure agreement I'd signed included specific penalties for early withdrawal or breach of confidentiality. The penalties were substantial. Several £1,000s in compensation for disrupted research. So I stayed. I watched as the scenarios became increasingly extreme, as the subjects were pushed beyond psychological breaking points. I made token bids on harmless options while others seemed to compete for the most creative forms of torment. By the end of the session, several of the subjects had suffered what appeared to be complete psychological breakdowns. They were catatonic, unresponsive, clearly traumatized by whatever they'd experienced in those rooms. The platform recorded our collective decisions and thanked us for our participation in the research study. Dr. Chen provided payment as promised, along with contact information for future research opportunities. She reminded us of our confidentiality obligations and the legal consequences of discussing the research with anyone outside the authorized team. I left Manchester that night feeling sick about what I'd witnessed and participated in. But I also had £500 in my account, and the promise of more work if I was interested. The money was more than I made in a week at my regular job. Over the following days, I tried to research the Institute for Behavioral Studies more thoroughly. The website was still there, but when I looked more carefully, the academic papers seemed to be fake. The staff profiles used stock photos, and the university affiliations couldn't be verified. I also started to doubt whether what I'd witnessed was actually research at all. The whole setup felt more like entertainment than academic study. The bidding system, the competitive element, the focus on causing distress rather than understanding behavior, it all suggested something much darker than legitimate research. But I couldn't report it without implicating myself. I'd signed legal documents, participated willingly, even made decisions that contributed to whatever those people had suffered. Any investigation would reveal my involvement and potentially lead to the legal consequences Dr. Chen had warned about. 2 weeks later, I received another invitation. Same format, same professional presentation. But this time, the compensation was higher, £1,000 for participation. The email mentioned that I'd been selected for a premium research program based on my previous contributions. I should have deleted it immediately. Should have blocked the sender and tried to forget the whole thing had ever happened. But £1,000 was substantial money, and I told myself that maybe I could participate without actively contributing to harm. Maybe I could bid on harmless options, try to protect the subjects rather than torment them. The second session was worse, much worse. The subjects weren't just being psychologically pressured, they were being physically harmed, not severely, but deliberately and systematically. Small injuries, controlled pain, careful degradation designed to break them down completely. And the other participants were enthusiastic about it. They were bidding enormous amounts on scenarios that would cause maximum suffering. The virtual credit system had been replaced with what looked like real money, pounds sterling being transferred in real time to implement specific forms of torture. I realized I wasn't participating in research at all. I was part of an audience paying to watch and direct real torture, broadcast live through the dark web to paying customers around the world. The professional presentation, the academic credentials, the research terminology, it was all camouflage for something much more sinister. The subjects weren't volunteers who had consented to psychological testing. They were victims, probably kidnapped or coerced, being tortured for the entertainment of people wealthy enough to pay premium prices for customized suffering. And I was one of them. By participating, by staying silent, by accepting payment for my involvement, I'd become part of a network that treated human torture as interactive entertainment. The sessions continued monthly. Each time, the compensation increased, and the scenarios became more extreme. I told myself I was trying to minimize harm by bidding on less severe options, but I knew I was just rationalizing my continued participation. The money was addictive. Thousands of pounds for a few hours of watching screens and clicking buttons. More than I made in months at my regular job. It let me move to a better flat, buy things I'd never been able to afford, live a lifestyle that would have been impossible on my normal salary. But I also knew that every session I attended meant more people were being tortured for entertainment. Real people suffering real pain, while audiences around the world paid to watch and participate in their degradation. The network was vast. What I thought was a small research study was actually one node in a global system. There were hundreds of these sessions running simultaneously, different themes and scenarios for different audiences. The technology allowed real-time interaction between viewers and victims, turning torture into a personalized entertainment service. The worst part was realizing how many people were involved The sessions I attended had dozens of participants, each paying substantial amounts for the privilege of directing human suffering. Multiply that across hundreds of simultaneous sessions, and you're looking at thousands of people who treat torture as entertainment. These weren't criminals or social outcasts. They were people with professional jobs, disposable income, the technical knowledge to access dark web platforms. They were probably colleagues, neighbors, maybe even friends and family members. Normal people who had found a way to pay for something monstrous while maintaining plausible deniability about their involvement. I still receive invitations to new sessions, premium events, exclusive content, opportunities to direct increasingly extreme scenarios. The compensation offers have reached amounts that would change my life permanently. Enough money to quit my job, buy a house, never worry about financial security again. And I'm tempted. Not because I enjoy watching people suffer, but because the money would solve every problem I have. Because it's easy to rationalize participation when the alternative is returning to financial stress and career uncertainty. The invitations come from different sources now, but they're clearly part of the same network. Academic institutions, research organizations, market research companies, all fronts for the same underlying system. They've probably identified thousands of potential participants, people with the right combination of financial need and moral flexibility to become part of their audience. The person sitting next to you at work might have attended one of these sessions last night. Your university lecturer, your doctor, your neighbor, any of them could be supplementing their income by paying to watch and direct real torture. And the victims could be anyone. People who responded to job advertisements, answered research invitations, trusted professional-looking organizations, people like me, who thought they were participating in legitimate work until it was too late to back out. The next time you see a research invitation with unusually high compensation, or a job opportunity that seems too good to be true, remember that some offers are designed to compromise you gradually, to make you complicit in something horrible through small steps and financial incentives. You might already be on their lists. They might already know exactly what compensation amount would be enough to make you consider participating. What professional presentation would convince you it was legitimate? And once you've attended one session, once you've accepted payment for your participation, you're part of the network whether you want to be or not. Because they know that most people, faced with the choice between exposing themselves or staying silent, will choose to protect their own interests, just like I did. The person sitting next to you on the bus this morning might have spent last night watching someone die for entertainment. Your neighbor, your colleague, maybe even someone in your own family could be part of a network that treats human suffering like a pay-per-view sporting event. You think I'm being dramatic, talking about urban legends and internet folklore, but I've seen the application forms. I know how they recruit people, because I filled one out myself. It started when I was unemployed and desperate. 6 months out of university with a degree in psychology and no prospects beyond 0-hour contracts at call centers. My student loan was hanging over me like a sword. Rent was due, and my parents kept asking when I was going to get a proper job. The kind of desperation that makes you consider things you'd normally never touch. I was browsing job sites when I found the posting. It wasn't on the usual platforms, not Indeed or Reed, or any of the mainstream ones. This was on a forum I'd stumbled across while looking for freelance work, the kind of place where people advertise cash-in-hand jobs that don't ask too many questions about your employment history. The post was vague but intriguing. Remote work, flexible hours, good pay for the right candidate. It mentioned psychological assessment and evaluation work, which seemed perfect for someone with my background. The pay was mentioned as being well above average, around £40 an hour for part-time work. For someone living on beans on toast and instant noodles, it sounded too good to be true. The application process was unusual. Instead of a CV and cover letter, they wanted you to fill out what they called a psychological profile assessment. Questions about your tolerance for disturbing content, your ability to remain objective in stressful situations, your views on personal privacy and consent. They asked about your internet usage, whether you'd ever access the dark web, how comfortable you were with cryptocurrency transactions. I should have been suspicious, but I was broke and desperate. I answered honestly about most things, maybe embellished my experience with difficult psychological cases from my university placements. The questions about disturbing content I assumed were standard for psychology work. You often have to deal with traumatic material when working with victims of abuse or violence. They got back to me within days, which was faster than any legitimate employer I'd contacted. The response came from an encrypted email service I'd never heard of, with instructions to download a specific browser and access a website through something called the Tor network. They explained this was for security purposes, to protect client confidentiality and ensure the privacy of sensitive psychological assessments. The website looked professional enough. Clean design, corporate language about psychological services and remote consultation work. There was information about their client base, wealthy individuals seeking discreet psychological profiling of people in their lives, ex-partners, business rivals, employees they suspected of disloyalty. The kind of grey area work that exists in the spaces between legal and illegal. My job, they explained, would be to observe individuals through various means and provide psychological assessments of their behavior, mental state, and likely responses to different situations. The pay was excellent because the work required complete discretion and a strong stomach for morally ambiguous situations. The first assignment seemed straightforward enough. I was given access to what they called an observation session, essentially a live video feed of someone's home. A woman in her 30s, living alone in what looked like a converted flat in London. The feed showed multiple angles of her living space, apparently from hidden cameras that had been installed without her knowledge. My job was to observe her routine over the course of a week and write a detailed psychological profile. Her habits, her emotional responses to different situations, her vulnerabilities and strengths. They were particularly interested in how she might react to unexpected stress or threatening situations. The money was deposited into my account within hours of accepting the assignment. Real money, more than I'd seen in months. Enough to pay rent, buy proper food, maybe even start paying down some of my student debt. All for what seemed like glorified people watching. The woman's routine was mundane. She worked from home, had video calls with colleagues, ate meals while watching Netflix, went to bed around 11 each night. I took notes on her behavior, her apparent emotional state, the way she responded to work stress or personal phone calls. It felt invasive, but I told myself this was just advanced market research or corporate intelligence gathering. After a week, I submitted my report and received payment immediately. The feedback was positive, and they offered me another assignment. This time the pay was higher, the observation period longer. I was building a reputation within their system, proving myself reliable and thorough. The assignments gradually became more intensive. Instead of just observing people in their homes, I was given access to feeds from multiple locations. Someone's workplace, their gym, their regular cafe. The psychological profiles became more detailed, focusing on specific vulnerabilities and potential breaking points. How someone might react to blackmail, what would cause them to have a mental breakdown, which family members they cared about most. I started to realize that these weren't just psychological assessments for corporate clients. The level of detail they wanted, the focus on vulnerabilities and stress responses, suggested something more sinister. But by then, I was earning more money than most of my university friends with proper jobs. I'd moved to a better flat, bought new clothes, started paying off my debts properly for the first time since graduation. The rationalization was easy. I wasn't hurting anyone directly. I was just observing and writing reports. Whatever clients did with that information wasn't my responsibility. I was providing a professional service, using my psychology training for legitimate consultation work. The fact that it operated through the dark web was just about client privacy and commercial discretion. The breakthrough assignment changed everything. Instead of just observing someone's routine, I was given access to what they called an interactive session. The target was a man in his 40s, living alone in Birmingham. The setup was similar, hidden cameras throughout his flat, but this time there were other viewers logged into the session. I could see a chat sidebar where other people were commenting on what they were watching. At first, it seemed like professional colleagues sharing observations and insights. But as the session continued, the comments became more disturbing. People were making suggestions about what should happen next, placing what looked like bets on how the target would respond to different scenarios. Then the phone started ringing in the man's flat. He answered it, and I watched his face change from confusion to fear. He hung up quickly, but the phone rang again immediately. This pattern continued for nearly an hour. Phone calls that clearly distressed him, followed by brief periods of peace, then more calls. The people in the chat were reacting with excitement, commenting on his stress responses and psychological deterioration. I realized I wasn't just observing anymore. I was watching someone being deliberately tormented, and the psychological profile I'd been asked to create was being used to determine the most effective ways to break him down mentally. The next few hours were horrific. The phone calls escalated to sounds outside his flat, footsteps in the hallway, knocking on doors, car alarms going off in the street below. Each incident was clearly orchestrated based on the psychological weaknesses identified in profiles like the one I'd written. The man became increasingly paranoid and distressed, eventually barricading himself in his bedroom, while the chat exploded with commentary and what were clearly financial transactions. People were paying to watch this man's psychological torture and paying extra to suggest new ways to torment him. The amounts being discussed were substantial, hundreds of pounds for specific requests, thousands for extended sessions. This wasn't corporate intelligence gathering. It was entertainment for people who enjoyed watching others suffer. I tried to close the browser, but found I couldn't log out of the session. A message appeared saying that all observers were required to complete the full assignment to receive payment. More disturbing was the implication that my participation was being recorded, and that leaving early would result in consequences for my future employment with the organization. So I watched. For another 6 hours, I watched as this man was systematically broken down through carefully orchestrated psychological pressure. The torment was designed using the same principles I'd learned in university: how to identify and exploit psychological vulnerabilities, how to create maximum distress through targeted manipulation. By morning, the man was catatonic with fear. He'd stopped responding to the phone calls and sounds outside his flat, just sitting in his bedroom staring at the wall. The chat had moved on to discussing how long it would take him to recover, whether he'd seek professional help, and how his mental state could be further exploited in future sessions. The payment for that assignment was more than I'd earned in the previous month combined. Along with the money came an invitation to become what they called a premium observer, with access to more exclusive content and higher paying assignments. The invitation mentioned that my psychological insights had been particularly valuable in designing effective torment strategies. I should have stopped then, should have deleted the browser, blocked the email addresses, pretended none of it had ever happened. But the money was addictive, and I'd already crossed lines I never thought I would. Each assignment pushed the boundaries a little further, normalized behavior that would have horrified me months earlier. The premium sessions were worse, much worse. Instead of just psychological torment, they escalated to physical interventions. Break-ins while people were away, designed to create paranoia and fear. Items moved or stolen to make targets question their own sanity. In extreme cases, actual physical harm, though this was presented as being carried out by independent contractors rather than the organization itself. The worst part was how systematic it all was. They had psychological profiles on thousands of people, detailed vulnerability assessments that could be used to destroy someone's mental health with surgical precision. The observers weren't just paying to watch random suffering. They were commissioning bespoke psychological torture based on scientific principles of human behavior. And I was part of it. My psychology degree, the knowledge I'd gained studying human behavior and mental health, was being used to cause maximum psychological damage to innocent people. I was helping to turn human suffering into entertainment for people wealthy enough to pay for front row seats to someone else's destruction. The organization started offering me more than just observation work. They wanted me to help develop new techniques, to use my academic background to design more effective methods of psychological manipulation. The pay for this consultancy work was enormous. More money than most people earn in a year for work that could be done in a few hours. I told myself I was just providing academic insight, that I wasn't directly involved in implementing the techniques, but I knew exactly how my research was being used. Every principle of psychological pressure I explained, every vulnerability I identified, every technique I suggested would be used to torment real people for the entertainment of paying viewers. The money let me live a life I'd never imagined possible. Expensive flat in London, designer clothes, holidays abroad, meals at restaurants I'd only read about in magazines. My parents were proud of how successful I'd become, how quickly I'd turned my life around after university. Friends were envious of my apparent success in such a competitive field. But I couldn't sleep properly anymore. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the faces of the people I'd watched being tormented. The man in Birmingham was just the first. There had been dozens since then, each one carefully selected and systematically destroyed for the entertainment of people who treated human suffering like a particularly engaging video game. The organization's reach was vast. They had contacts in security companies who could install hidden cameras, telecommunications workers who could intercept phone calls, even people in local councils who could provide information about vulnerable individuals. What I'd stumbled into wasn't just a website. It was a network that extended into legitimate institutions and businesses. The viewers weren't just random perverts either. The amounts of money being spent suggested wealthy individuals, possibly including people in positions of power and influence. Politicians, business leaders, celebrities, anyone with enough money and moral flexibility to pay premium prices for customized human suffering. After nearly a year of this work, I started to receive different kinds of assignments. Instead of just observing existing targets, I was asked to identify potential new ones. People in my personal life who might be suitable for psychological profiling and eventual targeting. Friends, family members, former classmates, anyone who might provide entertaining content for the organization's clients. The requests came with substantial financial incentives, bonuses for successful recruitment, ongoing payments for providing personal information about potential targets, premium rates for people I had close access to. They were particularly interested in my family, specifically my younger sister, who was starting university and living alone for the first time. That's when I realized I'd become more than just an employee. I was part of the network now, expected to provide targets from my own life in exchange for continued financial support. The organization had gradually normalized increasingly extreme behavior, using financial incentives and the threat of exposure to ensure compliance. I tried to quit, sent an email saying I was no longer available for assignments, that I wanted to end my association with the organization. The response was swift and terrifying. They had detailed records of my involvement, including video evidence of my participation in the interactive sessions. They knew where I lived, where my family lived, details about my personal life that I'd never shared with anyone. The message was clear. I could continue working for them voluntarily, or I could become one of their targets. They had enough information about my psychological profile to design a torment program that would be perfectly calibrated to my specific vulnerabilities and fears. More concerning was the implication that they'd been profiling me from the beginning. My initial application, the gradual escalation of assignments, the financial dependency they'd created. It had all been carefully planned to ensure my compliance. I wasn't just an employee who'd stumbled into something dark. I was a target who'd been recruited and conditioned to participate in my own exploitation. I'm still working for them, still writing psychological profiles, still participating in interactive sessions, still helping to design new methods of psychological torture. The money continues to flow into my account, and I continue to live a life that looks successful and comfortable from the outside. But I know what I really am now. I'm not a successful psychology consultant or a remote work entrepreneur. I'm a collaborator in an industry that treats human suffering as entertainment. Someone who uses academic knowledge to help wealthy perverts torment innocent people for fun. And the worst part is that I can't be the only one. The organization is too large, too sophisticated, too well connected to rely on just a few recruited academics. There must be hundreds of people like me, qualified professionals who started with legitimate seeming work and gradually found themselves complicit in something monstrous. Your therapist, your university lecturer, your GP, any of them could be supplementing their income by helping to design psychological torture programs. The person who assessed your mental health, who has access to your vulnerabilities and fears, might be selling that information to people who want to use it against you. The next time you feel like someone's watching you, like someone knows more about your personal life than they should, like someone's deliberately trying to make you paranoid or distressed, you might not be imagining it. You might be someone's premium entertainment, carefully selected and systematically tormented by professionals who know exactly which psychological buttons to push. And somewhere, people are paying good money to watch it happen.